Hey guys, welcome to the Black Ibis Social Club. Another fine episode on a thunderous South Carolina afternoon. You might hear a lot of thunder. There's lightning going on. Storm is coming from the south. Fisto sent it up here with his Floridian magic my way. So
You're welcome. You're welcome, sir.
if we get disconnected or there's some odd audio, it's because there's a storm raging above me, and South Carolina has not the best internet if you ever experienced it compared to everywhere else in the world. Today we got a special guest. Like always, we have special guests. And tonight we have Mr. Jason McGinty. And he is a fellow Substack writer and podcaster. He writes the Unsung Substack, where he hosts a history podcast. Currently, it's a 10-part series called American Guerrillas. And it's focused on early Kansas history, bleeding Kansas and the Kansas-Missouri border war of 1854 and 1865. For those of you guys, that's a Civil War era. And it has a lot to do with, for example, you might have heard of John Brown and the abolitionists around that whole event. But we'll let him talk about it. But hey, how you doing, Jason?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
Oh, welcome, man.
I can hear the thunder in the background. That's sounds like quite a storm.
Yeah, it sounds pretty cool. It actually I left work maybe an hour ago. I was running late, and it was all gray. Like it was sunny when I got in the car, and I drove for 5 minutes, and then just gray. And I'm like, oh man, I gotta beat this storm. So I might be muting my mic a lot more, especially if my dogs start howling in the back because they're afraid of the storm because they're dogs and dogs are afraid of the storm. But before we start, man, how you been doing, Fisto?
Good, man. Just another beautiful week on summer break. I did actually get some bad news, though. Turns out our assistant principal, the one that I really liked, resigned. So that's kind of some bummer news. I'm meeting with a couple of teachers on Monday, though. We're going to talk about the curriculum for next month, or for next year. So maybe I can find out what happened. That was a bit of a bummer. But other than that, yeah, life is fine. I finally wrote a thing that I published on my Substack that got some pretty good response. I've had some good conversations with people about it, and feel like it was worth doing. So
Yeah, I liked it.
that's me. Good. I'm glad, man.
I liked it. And there were some really good responses on it. There's a lot of really excellent long form, almost like full essays in the comments. That's my favorite. That is my favorite thing. When people take the time and they reply, it's not just like, ooh, blah, blah, and it's an actual
Full post, bro.
Yeah, it's like a cool intellectual reply that takes the conversation to the next level. I love that, man. That's what we do.
Yes. I think the two comments that summed it up were the one gentleman who raised 11 children.
Yeah.
9 of them boys, which is just slow clap. Well done, sir.
Doing the Lord's work there.
Yeah, man. And then on the flip side, the other gentleman who was just about to begin homeschooling his eldest. It was like, nice. Little broing out there a little bit. For the readers, for the listeners at home, I wrote about advice to young men by giving advice to people who are our age. So,
well,
guys like you.
That's who needs the advice, man.
Yeah, at the end of the day, yeah.
Yep. Especially some of us, like you and I both are, I guess, fortunate because in a way we're on the front lines. I work with young people where I fall into a mentorship kind of job, and you work with even younger people than I do because mine are technically adults, but they're young adults. And you work with teenagers, early teenagers, because you're like a ninth grade teacher, right?
Yeah, ninth grade. They're all 14 and 15. So
that's who needs it most. But yeah, that's a good one. I kind of like it.
Yeah, I heard that too.
Wow. It's setting the mood, like thunder and lightning.
It's ominous.
Yeah, very ominous. House is shaking. Okay. That's pretty
Careful.
Cool. It's South Carolina. It's built by Guatemalan illegal immigrants like 10 years ago. So of course it's probably going to fall apart first hurricane. But my week wasn't that exciting at all, to be honest. I went to church, I'm at the point in my life, I guess, where the most exciting thing is going to church, which is exciting because it should be exciting. I actually look forward to it. But I'm like, oh man, I can't wait to get to church. I go to church for Vespers and I go to church for liturgy and I go to church for everything. So that's what I'm looking forward to. And going to the pool a lot. It's been hot, going to the pool, work, doing some reading here. I'm rereading one of my favorite novels, The Magus by John Fowles, because I'm going to be on a podcast to talk about that next week. So I'm pretty excited about that one. And then we're going to do the movie thing, right? We agreed to do that?
Yes, I'm looking forward to that.
All right. So for listeners, we're going to try something kind of different next week, right? What we're going to do is I'm going to open up the podcast to a live stream so you can actually comment live, right? And it's going to be about a movie. It's going to be about my favorite movie called The Great Beauty. All right. It's an Italian movie from about a decade ago. It's one of the best movies ever made. And it's just, I think it's a masterpiece. It's honestly one of the best movies. And if you don't believe me, you're wrong because I've never steered you wrong. Have I ever recommended a book or a movie that you guys didn't like? No.
No, it's never happened. I mean, and even if you think that somehow just come to the live stream and you can hear us call you retards
Right.
live in your ear.
Yeah. So what we're going to do
great.
is I'm going to rewatch it and take a bunch of notes, probably this weekend when I get a chance. And Fisto's going to watch it with his wife, hopefully, and take notes.
Yes.
And then we'll talk about it
Yes.
on a live stream, regular time, 5:00 on Wednesdays. This is our regular recording time. It's going to be, a YouTube live stream, but through Substack. I can actually link the two. I've been doing some experimenting kind of on and off to get it to work. And you can comment live. And then the show will be recorded and it will come out like normal, the following day like it usually does. But I thought it'd be kind of cool to experiment with the live stream thing. It seems like all the cool kids are doing it and we're cooler than the cool kids. So we absolutely should be doing it too. We're not going to do video because I hate video. I mean, I am a very handsome individual. And I just don't want to be mogging everybody with my good looks,
I can't just break out this face for radio. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Like I like to basically get our fans and audience on my intellectualism alone. I don't want to be objectified due to my handsome appearance, okay? And I don't really want a bunch of female and gay dudes as like our audience because I'm going to be so handsome that people are going to just be falling over. And it's going to my face is so attractive that I would turn straight dudes gay and whatever. Anyways, that's why we don't do
Why do you think I do the podcast, man? Why do you think I do the podcast?
It's a favor to you guys. It's not because I'm like, trying to be like anon or anything like that because I'm not anonymous, but it's just, come on, it's just
Alex
unfair.
is mine, guys. I saw him first.
It's
right?
unfair to everybody, right?
That's just how it is.
It's like I'm basically like the fact that we do an audio podcast is basically a digital burqa for me. Like I have to not tempt you guys into
digital burqa
into my riz is so strong,
Yeah.
But yeah, that's
Well,
been
my wife
exciting.
might try to fight you.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
My wife might try to fight you.
I know what everybody looks like, so you guys are all handsome dudes too. All right, so Jason, welcome to the show. Welcome, and you are a longtime fan, and you're a member.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. By the way,
this private
is
exclusive
great to be
club.
here.
Yeah, you're a member of our private exclusive chat club, which, by the way, if you are a paid subscriber, you are more than welcome to click on that little link I send out to all the private subscribers to join us in our private Telegram. If you're not a private paid subscriber, please become one because that helps me and Fisto pay for this show. But Jason's a longtime fan and a member, so welcome. I've been a fan of yours and I've been reading your work for a while. I was rereading your work. Some of your earlier Substacks, yesterday to prepare for the show. And I was like, oh, I've already read this. So a lot of it was like, it wasn't like freshly new to me. Actually, I was like, oh, I've read this stuff for a while now. So which makes sense. I read a lot of stuff from all you guys and I don't always put it together with who's who because it all kind of blends into each other. Except for John Carter's stuff, because his stuff is essay, like a novel length every post. So like I know it's his because it's like here's 800 pages worth of Substack posts. But I love you, John Carter. You're the best. But yeah, Jason, tell us a little bit about your Substack and your history podcast. I want to hear all about it.
Yeah, well, mainly my main thing is the podcast. So I write stuff on Substack every now and then as the mood strikes, but mainly it's the podcast. So that's about Bleeding Kansas is what I started with. And it's not like I haven't been doing this very long. It's like less than a year, I think. But the first topic I got interested in was Bleeding Kansas, mostly because I'm from Kansas and I grew up kind of not really learning about that because I was in, normie school. Um, but part of the motivation for doing the podcast in the first place was realizing that I had almost no knowledge about the topic, despite being raised in Kansas. So that's kind of how I got started. I can talk more about that if you want. It depends where you want to go with it.
Well, before we get deeper into the topic, right? Now, you guys know I'm a Romanian-born Californian. All right, so I was born in Europe and I grew up in California, and I have been history has been my favorite topic, my favorite like academic topic since I was a little kid. I when I was 5 years old, my grandmother was a history teacher herself, and she took me around Europe, Eastern Europe, Romania, to all the churches and all the castles and all the battlegrounds. And, some of my earliest memories are being taken to ancient history museums. And I knew, as much as I could. I remember all the books I had were history books, and I read entire, giant, thick World War II history books when I was in elementary school for fun. And, I still have a lot of them, and that, I was that was kind of like my boys mindset. And then as I grew up, I went to school and I studied history a little bit in college. I became more intrigued by social history and by like art history and cultural history than military history the older I got. And that's kind of how I am now. But I want to admit something. I have a very big blind spot when it comes to American Civil War history, right? If you guys remember from previous podcast, with John Carter, I believe we talked about the French and Indian War, which is a kind of a war that a lot of Americans aren't familiar with, even though it's like the precursor to the Revolutionary War. I'm much more familiar with that war than I am with the American Civil War. I mean, I know your high school level and early college, like undergrad level understanding of the Civil War, but I've never gotten deep into like the good history. So when I was looking through your podcast and through your Substack, I was like, wow, that was really interesting. I never knew about Bleeding Kansas and Bloody Kansas or the Border Wars. And I feel like I learned a lot more, and especially now that I'm a self-adopted Southerner by living in South Carolina, and I've spent a lot of time. I'm one of these guys. I don't know if you do this, Fisto or Jason. When I move anywhere, what I do is I go into like the depths of history of where I move. Right. When I moved to Japan, I read everything there was about Japan that I could reasonably find and understand. I wanted to learn as much as possible. When I lived in California, I got deep into California history, and that's kind of like, but I read local history, what's going on. I like, at Barnes and Noble, they sell those little tiny books that are like little town histories or whatever, like the history of the ferry or the history of like blah, blah, blah in Bluffton, South Carolina. I read all those things, man. I'm all about that. Like I go to all the local museums and the local historical associations. So I'm getting a lot more into the Civil War now because, well, the secession tree is like 10 minutes away from my house, right?
Nice.
So Southern history and Civil War history are very synonymous in a way, right? The town I live in, Bluffton, South Carolina, was Old Town Bluffton, not where I live now, but like the center, kind of like downtown area. It's filled with Civil War memorials and monuments because it was burnt down by the Union Army in during the Civil War. I live across the river from Savannah, Georgia, which also took part in the Civil War. And then an hour north of me is Charleston, where the Civil War formally started, right? So I'm kind of, in Civil War, like Grand Central in a way, right? If you really think about it, in South Carolina. So I've been catching myself up, but I don't know anything about Kansas. Matter of fact, I don't know anything about Kansas now, before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and I'll be honest, Jason. I am. My knowledge of Kansas is basically the Wizard of Oz. Okay, so
Yeah, you'll never guess I've heard that one before.
Yeah.
Is that in Kansas? Was that movie in Kansas? I didn't even.
Yeah, Dorothy was from Kansas.
Dorothy was from Kansas.
Oh, that's right.
We're not in Kansas anymore,
I know
right?
that. I know that.
So
we're not in
basically,
Kansas anymore, Toto.
yeah. So basically, coming into this conversation, I am Dorothy. Okay, and then I don't know how much Fisto knows about Kansas, but he might end up being my Toto. So we'll have to see. How much do you know about? Do you know anything about Bleeding Kansas and Kansas history, Fisto?
In passing, I'm somewhat familiar with its role in the lead up to the Civil War. Like I said in the email the other day, that's why I'm so excited to have Jason on the show, because I want all of the Kansas deep lore. Like I'm expecting to just sit back and get a lecture, like just so
Nice.
we're clear. I've been to Kansas a couple times in my life. A long time ago, we would take family trips over the summer, and I have very fond memories of staying in St. Louis and then traveling west across the Great Plains into Colorado. I believe I've been through Kansas City a couple times. I have memories of lots of railroads. Like, that's a big railroad town, right?
Yep.
Like the railroad town, if I recall.
Yeah, Union Station is there.
Yeah. I think I've seen some of the yards there, and it was like, what in the bloody? But that was when I was a young boy, so I don't have fond memories, or not fond. I don't have very good memories of it, like, in my mind. I imagine it's probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been through Nebraska, and then I've spent some time in Iowa. Although I know Kansas is a little bit further south, so I'm sure that's got a different kind of vibe, but. Yeah, I've got some experience with it, and then I have, a passing understanding within the context of the Civil War. But yeah, I'm super excited to hear all about it because, like you were saying, Alex, when I moved to my hometown here, like, yeah, I checked out some of the local history. Like, I wouldn't say I did a deep dive, but I probably know more about it than some of the people living here for sure. Certainly much more than any of my students do. And there's some cool stuff around here that I've checked out because it's like, oh, that's here, yeah, let's go look. So, anyway.
Yeah.
Well, so before I let you begin, I want to get some Kansas like stuff out of the way. So you are you a native Kansas guy?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Native Kansan. I don't live there anymore, but I was born there and grew up there.
Okay. What is a native Kansan called? A Kansan? Is that
Kansan? Yeah.
Kansan.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And Kansas counts as a Midwestern state.
I've heard different things. I grew up thinking it was Midwestern. I've also heard people say it's not actually Midwestern because they think of the Midwest as like Iowa, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois.
Yeah.
But I grew up thinking it was Midwestern. I don't know what's technically right. I think it's I think now I'd probably call it more of a Great Plains state.
Yeah.
Than a Midwestern state.
Yeah, that's what I always thought growing up. Being from Ohio, Kansas was like, if you said Midwest, you weren't going to get corrected.
Yeah.
But in the back of your mind, everybody's like, Great Plains.
Yeah.
Subtle difference, but it's real.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, and when we're talking about Kansas, we have, Dorothy, right, from the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and then does a Little House on the Prairie take place in Kansas? I think it does, right?
Parts of it, yeah.
Okay. And Superman is from Kansas, right?
Metropolis, yeah.
Right. Was it Superman
which
Iowa?
Is not a real town.
Was it Superman Iowa?
No, I think he's
I think he was Kansas, wasn't
he? Yeah. I'm looking it up right now.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
Smallville,
me too.
Smallville, not Metropolis.
Smallville, that's
Smallville
right.
is in
Not Metropolis
Kansas.
is the
Yeah.
big city, right?
And Metropolis is like
I'm
New
not a
York.
comic book fan. I
No,
don't know
me
anything about
either.
Superman.
That's why he was actually created by Canadian
Oh,
Jews.
Smallville, Kansas. Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
he's not even American. Oh,
Make culpa.
Truman Capote's In Cold Blood was set in Kansas.
That's what I was thinking of. I was
Okay.
like, there's something else that was out
I'm trying
there.
to remember all the things that, are Kansas in our
We got Dwight Eisenhower.
Oh, that's right.
We
Good
got
old
Amelia
Ike.
Earhart.
okay.
Yeah. You got some
Okay.
good ins.
Good
Yeah, we
stuff
got Dodge
there.
City, which is a big cow town back in the Old West.
Yep. Missouri River. Or
Right. Okay, so
When
the east
the
side of
Missouri
you
River
there.
takes the bite out of the northeast corner, yeah.
Yep.
When I
so
was in
Ca-
school, actually, as a kid, we would we when we'd be doing like I don't know Kansas history stuff in elementary school, like young elementary school, we'd do this thing where I'm from Topeka, which is the capital, and we do this thing where we take a graham cracker and like spread peanut butter on it and put a chocolate chip where Topeka goes, and then take a bite out of the northeast corner, and
Oh, that's funny.
make Kansas with a graham cracker.
that's
Yeah.
funny. Well, so
Sounds
Kansas,
tasty.
for demographic population growth right now, it's a majority white, non-Hispanic state. It's a red
Based.
state. It's a red state. Let me see what the population. Let's see what the population is. Kansas. I'm curious to compare it to South
It's
Carolina.
sort of it is a red state. We have weird politics though. Um, the I'll have to check. You have to check the facts on this, but our state legislature is dominated by Republicans, but also, and we always vote Republican for president. Like I don't remember. I don't even. It's been like 50 years or something since we voted for a Democrat. Um, but it's weird. Like half the time, the governor ends up being a Democrat anyway. Like even though everything else is super red, and it's because of the cities like Topeka, Lawrence,
Mm,
Kansas City, and
yeah.
Wichita are comparably liberal to everywhere else, and they all vote blue, and they dominate sometimes the governor votes.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Well, looking at a map of the United States, Kansas is like dead in the middle. It is
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
dead in the
Dead
middle of the
center.
continent. So it's hard to say because, at some points you could say, well, it's got like kind of like a southern kind of folksy vibe to it because it's right there by, sort of in that area, but not really. And it could be the Midwest, but it has Wild West kind of vibes to it with, Dodge City, and you kind of think of the kind of like the beginning of the cattle trails and stuff, very similar to Oklahoma because it's right above Oklahoma.
Yeah, and the
So,
Santa Fe Trail went through there too.
right,
That was already there before the Civil War.
right. So you got you've got the probably a lot of Native
Guys there?
Americans historically. Yeah, we're here still.
Oh, yeah. Lost you for a moment. Sorry.
Um, yeah, very interesting. Like I said, I don't know much about Kansas. I missed it when I went on my cross country trip a few years ago. I ended up going south of Kansas. I went to Oklahoma instead. Um, but I've always wanted to go to Kansas. All right, so let's talk about your. Actually, one more note. The population in Kansas is somewhere around 2 million, so it actually has less population than South Carolina does, which has 5 million people. So it's pretty interesting. Um,
Yeah, people don't. Something that people are surprised by is how sparse everything is out here. It's like, um, and I remember this when I went out to. I lived on the East Coast for a while. When I went to college, and I had grown up in Kansas, and then I moved out to the East Coast, and it's like everything is so much more dense out there. Like the cities are closer together. There's no like long stretches of country where there's just nothing for miles. But it is that way in Kansas. Like you can, if you ever drive on I-70 out west, it's like you come across little towns. Sometimes you can drive for hours. Well, not hours, but you can drive for, long stretches at a time without seeing a town. And it's kind of, it can be kind of trippy if you've never seen that kind of thing before.
it is wild actually, and you I saw it myself in my cross country trip because okay, so I grew up in Los Angeles County, right? And for comparison, uh, the entire population of South Carolina and Kansas combined is a few million less than just Los Angeles County.
Yeah, that's wild.
I'll tell you right now exactly what the population is. So Los Angeles County is 9.7 million. Uh, just a county, right? A county in California. It's not even a very big county. It's a very dense county. And then the population of South Carolina is 5 million and Kansas is 2 million. So, about 2 million short of the population of just one county in both our states. So that's
Yeah.
pretty interesting, the population
Yeah,
of
the sorry, go ahead.
so the population of the entire of the state of Kansas is less than the population of it's about equal to or less than the entire population of Miami-Dade County, by the way, to compare it to Florida. Right.
Yep.
So yeah, not a lot of people out there, All right, Jason. So let's talk about the Bleeding Kansas. Tell us about it. Give us kind of a quick overview. I don't want you to go into excruciating details, some interesting facts, because I want people to go and listen to your podcast. You just finished episode 8. You got 2 more to go based on your projected kind of goal. So give us
Yeah.
get us interested in it, man.
Yeah,
Teach
well,
us.
I guess so I just finished episode 8, like finished editing it, so I hope to have it out tomorrow. But anyway, yeah, so you everybody thinks when people think about the Civil War, they think about 1861 to 1865, right? It starts with Fort Sumter, right? Um, but a lot of people don't know about Bleeding Kansas, or if they have, it's like, they heard about maybe they've heard of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and then um, they've heard about some of the violence that happened out there, but almost nobody knows any details about it. And I didn't either, which is weird because I had learned about Bleeding Kansas in my state history classes in school. So, but it was, not very detailed at all. Um, so I guess the basic, like in a nutshell, what happened is there was a Kansas act of Congress passed called the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, and that opened up Kansas and Nebraska territories for settlement. So it created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. And so there was the whole debate about slavery back then, and there was a balance between northern and southern states, free and slave states in the Senate, which is important because, voting power, right? Like every state gets 2 senators, and so regardless of population. So it was important to maintain that balance for the sake of compromise. Um, so when the Kansas Nebraska Act was passed, or actually, I'll give it to you the first. I'll tell you at first how I kind of learned about it in school. Um, so the Kansas Nebraska Act was passed, and then settlers started coming to Kansas. And then about all I learned about it in school was that Missourians started coming over the border and voting in Kansas elections illegally to try to make it a slave state. Um, because Missouri was a slave state, and they're like, feeling threatened by it or something. Like it's never really explained exactly why they did that. Um, but that touches off a bunch of violence in Kansas territory, and but the kind of the deeper cut on it, like the next level deeper, is that the reason they did that, or the reason Missourians felt like they needed to do that, was first of all because when that act was passed, there was a lot of thought in the South. Like people in the South tended to think that this was like a tacit agreement where the North would take Nebraska and the South would take Kansas. Like Kansas would be a slave state, Nebraska would be a free state, and they would maintain the balance in the Senate. Um, that didn't end up happening because of a guy or a couple of guys, one of them named Eli Thayer and another one named Amos Lawrence. Eli Thayer first of all, he was from Massachusetts. He was a Yankee, founded the Immigrant Aid Society for the purpose of sending radical abolitionist New Englanders to Kansas to settle it, gain political power there, and make it a free state. But the thing about that is that they weren't just trying to make it a free state. They were explicit, and you can read Thayer's own comments about this, and I do in the podcast. But he was explicitly trying to make Kansas into New England on the frontier. Like that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to export Yankee culture out to the plains. And let's just say that New Englanders looked down on Missourians. They were not they were not going to get along, right?
They still do, right?
Exactly. Um, so they go out there and at first Kansas was actually majority pro-slavery. The actual settlers that were there were majority pro-slavery at first. But the people in, the movers and shakers were these immigrant aid society people that the New Englanders were sending over there. So this touched off a whole series of events that we can get into more, but this is the reason why Missourians wanted to control Kansas politically, is because they saw these Yankees coming over here and thought, wow, these guys really don't like us. We don't like them either. And we don't want them right next door to us. Like we don't want them controlling Kansas. So that's what this whole thing was about.
So in a way, you could say that it was a early, like pre-Civil War battleground over the debate of the initial compromise, right, between the states. In a way, it was kind of like to tie it into Visto's pet favorite historical era. In a way, this was kind of a Spanish Civil War of the American Civil War, I guess, in a way, where there was kind of a territory and people were doing their unofficial, official fighting over land that wasn't officially part of anything yet, in a way, right? Would you say that that's accurate?
Well, I don't know anything about the Spanish Civil War really, but yeah, it was
in so much as sorry, I'll interject for a moment. In so much as it was the fascists and the communists having their first blows at each other, or taking the opportunity to kind of test each other out and see how things might go. The Spanish Civil War was very much a Spanish fight, but the communists and the fascists got involved for various reasons and blah, 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 blah. So it's kind of the lead up to World War II. So in the analogy here is you've got local politics with Kansas and Missouri and Nebraska, and then you've got the Yankees, this other group coming in and trying to work out, their own thing as well. So complicated situation regardless.
Yeah. And it ended up being very complicated because there's at least three different groups. Like broadly speaking, there's at least three different groups of settlers that end up there. One is the Yankees, and they're a small minority, but they tend to be elites, right? So they're going to, influence politics more than the majority, because that's how politics usually works. But the other two groups, obviously, you have the Missourians who are coming over to settle. And then in the end, the majority ends up being Northwesterners. So like people from Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, all those Northwestern states that tend to come there not out of, abolitionist ideologues, but out of there's land here that you can have and make a better life for yourself. So it ends up being complicated because of that, and the abolitionist elites end up leveraging the Northwesterners to their political ends. Like they end up getting them on their side, and the Missourians end up pushed out in the end.
So this all happened before Kansas was actually a state, because Kansas became a state in 1961, right? 1861. That's what I meant to say. Sorry, guys. Yeah. And it became, and that's right when the Civil War started in 1861.
Right. So the Fort Sumter was in April 1861, I believe, and Kansas became a state in January of 1861. So it was just before. And actually, something on that, the southern states started seceding in late 1860. So I can't remember what the number was, but there were already a few states that had seceded by the time Kansas was admitted, and that's important because actually the time Kansas got actually admitted as a state was their fourth attempt. They had had three attempts before that, which were held up for various reasons. A lot of it had to do with the fact that the Senate was deadlocked between northern and southern states. So then once the southern states dropped out of the Union, then the Northerners had the majority in the Senate and they could approve Kansas as a free state.
Okay. Okay. Whoa, it's getting right above me. So I'm looking it up right now. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union in December 1860. That's interesting. I just find it fascinating. So now, did Kansas come into the Union as a slave state or as a free state?
Free state.
And that's mainly because of the bloody Kansas, bleeding Kansas kind of insurgency or kind of pre-Civil War fighting, right?
Yeah. So there's a bunch of, I don't know how much detail you want me to go into here, but
I
yeah,
say as
there's
much
a
as you want. This is awesome.
yeah, there's a bunch of fighting there. John Brown is involved. We should definitely talk about him.
Yeah, I was going to
Yeah.
save him for a little bit later, but so we
Yeah,
can paint the picture.
he's involved. There's a bunch of fighting. There's one of the guys, one of the main, a couple of the main political figures are Charles Robinson and Jim Lane. So Charles Robinson was the agent of the Immigrant Aid Society who led the first group to settle Kansas when they first formed the company. And he was like the political guy. Like he was also a Massachusetts Yankee. He had some experience in California before this. But he showed up there and he was kind of like the political leader. Jim Lane was also a political leader, but he's kind of a wild character. He's almost as colorful as John Brown, I would say. But he was a Mexican War veteran. He was a Northwesterner, and these two guys are both leaders of the Free State Party, but they're always butting heads with each other. Like they're at each other's throats all the time, and they're political rivals. And they end up representing like Charles Robinson represents the Yankee faction, the Northeasterners, and Jim Lane represents the Northwesterners, who tend to be more like less ideological and more into like moving to Kansas to make a better life for themselves. But in a weird kind of way, Lane ends up being the more radical of the two and the more violent of the two. So it's complicated.
So let's get to the violence. How did the
Yeah.
violence break out?
Yeah. Well, the violence broke out in 1855. So the act was passed in 1854. They show up. People start settling. There's all this tension, like building tension. And then in November of 1855, there's an altercation between a free state settler and a slave state settler. And by all the accounts I've seen, this was not a politically motivated killing, but the pro-slavery guy ended up killing the free state guy. And that was like the inciting incident to this whole thing. So there's a series of events after that, like the party that was in political power at the time was the pro-slavery party, which also held the majority of the settlers. And so there was this killing that was interpreted as political, even though it probably wasn't. Like it was these two guys were just having a personal beef, and one killed the other. But so the sheriff of Douglas County, which is where Lawrence is. Lawrence is named after Amos Lawrence, by the way, the Aid Society guy. So the sheriff of Douglas County goes to arrest, uh, sorry, the pro-slavery guy ends up. Sorry, I'm getting all mixed up now. Um,
So the pro-slavery guy, what?
yeah, okay. So the pro-slavery guy kills the free state guy.
Right.
Okay, that's where we're at.
Yes. So they've killed each other, and everybody's now the big mad.
Yeah, everybody's big mad. Um, and there's a whole complicated series of events, but at the end of the day, what ends up happening is the sheriff of Douglas County puts a different Free State guy under arrest. This was a friend of the guy that got killed. He puts him under arrest, and his Free State buddies get together, get a posse together, and rescue him at gunpoint from the sheriff.
Oh, wow.
And so Missourians are like there because there's this whole political apparatus in Missouri that's supporting the pro-slavery settlers.
Mm.
Um, so after that happens, Missourians are pissed, and the pro-slavery Kansans are pissed, and so there's this. They get together this army of like hundreds of Missouri militiamen, and they march into Kansas to Lawrence, which is like the main seat of political power for the Free State Party.
Yeah, just for the record, while you're telling this, I'm looking at a map, and Douglas County is really just outside Kansas City to the west. So like this is not very far from the border of Missouri and Kansas. Just for listeners at home, because it's interesting to visualize this. What was Kansas City like at the time? Was it big yet, or I have
No,
no
it was
idea.
pretty small.
Oh, okay,
It was only a
interesting.
few thousand people.
Yeah, how many total people are kind of involved in Kansas at this point? I mean, you got to be in the thousands, right?
Yeah, it's not very many. It's
Huh. Wow.
just in the I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what the population of the
Yeah.
territory was, but it was growing all the time because it was a brand new
Yeah.
territory, but it was
Yeah.
still, not very many people. Yeah.
Thousands on the frontier,
Right.
basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Where you could just do things.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, all right. So the militia heads out from Missouri and everybody's the big mad. What happens
Yeah, so
next?
they march on Lawrence, and they're like,
Mhm.
we're going to march in there and enforce the law because they figured that, like, the sheriff had arrested this guy um legally because he's the sheriff,
Right.
but free staters the free staters are thinking, that guy's our enemy, like our political enemy.
Oh,
and
interesting.
and so doesn't matter, like laws are kind of tools, political tools. It's like you don't, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right, absolutely. And oh, my thunder's going crazy out here, but I'm sorry. I'm gonna let you guys continue. I'm listening. But the way I picture it is that, like, I mean, this is pretty small town stuff, right? It's like little posses, and there's probably a lot of personal beefs on top of the regular, kind of political beefs. So this is interesting. This is fascinating kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So this militia army marches into
yeah, what
Lawrence, and
happens?
like, so they set up like a full-blown encampment. This is called, if you read about this, it's called the Wakarusa War. The Wakarusa River is a river that flows into the Kansas River, you know, right around Lawrence. So they camp on the Wakarusa River south of Lawrence, and there's this standoff in December for like a couple weeks. The Lawrence folks get together their own militia because they think they're about to get attacked. So they, raise a militia of their own. They prepare to defend the town, and they have this standoff for a couple weeks. Um, and it ends up just being a standoff. Like it does, they don't actually fight at that point. Um, the Missouri, like there's an agreement. There ends up being an agreement between the leaders. The guy that was arrested by the sheriff gets turned back over to him. And the Charles Robinson agrees, or the Free State leaders agree to cooperate with the legal authorities, and everybody goes home. But nothing is resolved. Of course, it's like this is just a like step one in the escalation, right?
Yeah. Okay. So what happens from there? What's kind of the free state and slave state people? Where do they go from here?
Yeah. Well, there's kind of a pause. Actually, one of the reasons there was a pause in the violence was because the winter hit,
Ah,
and there was a giant snowstorm that December that kind of put a damper on things. Um, But 1856 is when the violence really got kicked off. And I guess this is a good time to bring up John Brown because he was kind of the instigator of it all.
Right. And now I know about John Brown, even though I'm not as well versed in Civil War and abolitionist history. Uh, John Brown, you probably learned about him in, I think, probably middle school or even elementary school. The Thunder. John Brown is the famous kind of radical abolitionist, right? He's not just your basic abolitionist, but he's your kind of
Right.
a terroristic abolitionist.
Well, to be clear, at the time, all of the abolitionists were radical.
Right, 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 right.
But John Brown was the radical of the radicals.
Okay. How does he get wrapped up in all this? How does he show
So,
up on the scene?
well, he showed up there to get involved in this whole Kansas thing. It- and he was involved in the Wakarusa War. He was in Lawrence,
Mm,
or at least showed up in Lawrence during the time that was going on. And he he was pissed basically that there was no fighting. It's like he was trying to instigate fighting. He was like,
okay.
let's not even wait for them to come to us. Let's go out there and attack them.
He's an accelerationist.
Yeah, so he was trying
100%.
to get that
Okay.
going. He was pissed and disappointed that it didn't go down.
Right.
So anyway, there's another event, and it's been a while since I've actually been over these things, but so you have to forgive me if I leave out some details. But
No, it's fine.
so later in 1856 is when all the stuff really kicked off.
Okay.
So there was another one of these series of events where the pro-slavery party kind of took over politics in the territory, and um, they were being repressive, like punishing their enemies, right? Like they were doing all this stuff to the Free State Party,
Right.
and
Was that in response to what had happened in Lawrence?
well, yeah, that was part of it. They were like,
Okay.
we can't let these guys defy the law, basically.
Right.
So Charles Robinson and a bunch of his political friends ended up setting up an extra legal government. So this is like, radical stuff, right? They're setting up a parallel government and claiming to be the rightful government of Kansas, even though the duly elected governor and the duly elected legislature are all pro-slavery. They say that because of all the illegal voting that Missourians did, this election was illegitimate. Like, tell me if you've heard this stuff before, right?
I was just gonna say there's a lot of parallels here.
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
there?
yeah. So, and actually, the Missourians, it seems to me like the Missourians made a pretty big mistake by doing this fraud because everybody seems to agree that even if they had not committed this voter fraud, the pro-slave party would have still won the elections.
No.
So it's like they didn't even need to do this, but they did it and ended up. You'd have absurd situations where there'd be like, you know, 100 people in a precinct, and you'd get like 4,000 votes cast or something.
Yeah.
And it's like, absurd stuff like that makes it obvious that there's fraud going on. Um, and of course, and so the Free Staters are like, well, these elections are illegitimate. We're going to set up our own government. Um, and they set up a parallel government that they claimed was the rightful government of the territory. Um, and of course, the pro-slave party couldn't allow that. They end up throwing a lot of these people in jail. And there's another one of these series of events where the Missouri militia gets together and marches on Lawrence again, but this time there's no leaders of the Free State Party in Lawrence because they're all in jail or fled the territory.
Okay.
So the militia just marches in there with no resistance. They burn some buildings. This is called the sack of Lawrence, and it's not much of a sack really.
Yeah.
They burn the Free State Hotel, which is like one of the main landmarks in Lawrence. Um, they ransack some newspaper offices. Nobody gets killed. Um, some people get robbed, but it's pretty tame as, sacks of towns go.
Yeah, so it's a mostly peaceful protest.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Perfect.
yeah, yeah.
That's funny.
Um, so they go in there and do that, and of course they're all blustery about it. It's all this
Right.
frontier bravado stuff. Um, and so while that's happening, John Brown is living like to the south. He's in this town called living near this town called Oswatami.
Well, let's take
And
a quick pause real fast here, right? Let's do a quick mini refresher history on who John Brown is specifically, like his history real fast, because I think he's very interesting in this aspect. If you want to kind of go into that real quick.
yeah, so if you look up a painting called Tragic Prelude, the listeners can do this. You guys can do it too if you want. But there's this painting called Tragic Prelude, and the original is a mural in the Kansas State Capitol building. Um, and so when I was a kid in school and we'd go visit the Capitol building and tour it, we'd see this painting. And if you look at it, it's super dramatic. It's like
Yeah.
John Brown
Oh,
standing,
wow.
like in this cruciform pose with a rifle and a Bible.
And a
And there's all
tornado.
there's a tornado, there's prairie fire, there's all these symbols of the Civil War. And so as a kid you see that, and this mural is like 12 feet tall or something. So it's massive.
Yeah,
Right.
it'd almost have to
And
be massive.
yeah, you go to the Capitol building and you see this, and you as a kid and you're like, wow, who is this guy? Um,
What'd he do, mister?
yeah, yeah.
Oh,
So yeah,
incredible.
John Brown was he really didn't do much in his life before the Civil War, or before Bleeding Kansas anyway. But what he's most famous for is trying to start a slave rebellion in Harper's Ferry, Virginia in 1859. So that's later, after Bleeding Kansas. But he failed. And I have more to say about that. I question whether he was actually trying to start a slave rebellion. I can explain that more later, but he failed. He was tried and executed, and became this abolitionist symbol of resistance for the North. Like there's a marching song called John Brown's Body that was written, and units would march to this during the war, and he became this symbol of abolitionism and the North. So that's kind of who he was.
He was also, if I read correctly, the first American to be executed for treason.
Was he the first?
I believe so. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
If I
That's
if I
interesting, though.
if I read correctly in let me pull up his Wikipedia real fast because I feel like I remember that fact from before. Um, let's see.
Seems like there would have been somebody else before him, right?
I don't think there was anybody else. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
no, according to the Google,
Huh.
it was
Interesting.
Mr. Brown.
yeah, he was the first person executed for treason in the history of the United States.
Well, you guys taught me something.
There you go. That's a heck of an accomplishment, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
First time for everything.
Yeah, right.
The
He's
real
like,
question,
"Well,
the real question is, who was the first African American woman to be executed for treason?
that'll be what people really want to know."
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I haven't heard from Kamala Harris in a while. Is she still around? I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is interesting. So John Brown, what's driving these abolitionists? Do you think?
So, well, so
What's the real influence between these two groups spoiling over Kansas of all places? Like, what's really going on here? Do you think?
well, it's different for different people,
Yeah,
or different for different groups anyway. So the Yankees are driven by ideology, like abolitionism,
yeah,
and that gets into their theology. Honestly, I think, um, because so that region is descended from Puritans, right?
Yep.
And and I have not read all that deeply into that deep history to understand Puritanism in great depth and like where it came from and how it influenced American politics early on. But um, I can say that they were everybody thinks of them as the stodgy conservatives because they're famous for the Salem witch trials, right? They're famous for being super repressive on their people, like they're super conservative and they do all this weird religious stuff. In reality, they were the most progressive people around at the time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the Puritans come out of Germany. Their like DNA is from Lutheranism and Calvinism in Germany. They have their roots in the Munster Rebellion. They were basically too progressively extreme for the European Christians. They were obviously too progressive for the Roman Catholics. And then this is during the 30-year war. But they were too progressive and extreme and radical for the Lutherans and the Protestants, who also kicked them the hell out of mainland Europe. Yeah. They ended up in England, and they were way too progressive for the English Civil War Christians, who were also Protestant, progressive revolutionaries themselves. And so they got yeeted over to the United States, where they ended up kind of fading out, like as a political entity after their initial kind of extremism got tampered down by business interests and moderate kind of Protestantism. But eventually, but they are, I think, and the people make arguments about this, but a lot of people say that the progressive movement in the United States is a direct extension of Northeastern Puritanism.
Yeah.
I mean, you see the kind of behavior of what we would consider Puritanism in very radical left-wing circles, kind of like purity spirals and an obsession with purity, as in political purity and ideological purity, that you don't see in right-wing ideological circles at all. It's a very Puritan kind of left-wing kind of mindset, and it's fascinating actually.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is what John Brown comes out of. Like he's like that's kind of his ideological descent. You know what I mean?
Okay.
So the Puritans are like they're not calling them, and actually if I'm not mistaken, the name Puritan was a reference to how they thought the Anglican Church needed to be purified of Catholic influence, and it was it's not something they called themselves. It was a pejorative that other people applied to them back in England.
Yeah.
And it's also worth mentioning that the ones that came to America were not all the Puritans, but were they're called the Separatists, and they're like the most Puritan of the Puritans, right? So those are the ones that settled, Massachusetts and the Northeast.
That's my family, incidentally.
Yeah.
We were part of some of the original settlers, some of the original pilgrims.
Just extremists. Just, what, you could just say your family went along with it, man. You're like, hey, I was Fisto, the blacksmith that got hired as a contractor, and
Fisto the clothier. That's what I would have been.
Yeah. But so the thing about them is like they're it's like constitutionally they cannot just let other people be. It's like
we got to save your soul, man.
Yeah, like it's like one solution to this whole slavery thing might have been, okay, we don't like slavery. We're not going to have it up here. You guys do it if you want to. And let's not mess with each other. It's not worth killing 1 million people over. But they can't do that. And like that's what the Kansas thing was about. That's what the Immigrant Aid Society was about. They're like,
well, you see, sir, we're on a mission from God. So
yeah,
I don't know.
exactly.
I don't know why your faith is so weak, friend.
Yeah, well, and that's
kidding,
Protestantism comes into it too, because like this is part of this whole atmosphere. It's like America's overwhelmingly Protestant, and everybody buys into the sola scriptura doctrine. where scripture is the ultimate authority for doctrine. And what happens when you have different interpretations of scripture? Like there's no authority to mediate that. And so the Northerners are using, or the abolitionists are using scripture to justify abolitionism, and the Southerners are using it to justify slavery. And it's like,
Yep.
okay, who's gonna tell us who's wrong and who's right? Like there's
Well,
nobody, because they have no normative authority for that.
yeah, the barrel of a gun is what eventually
Exactly.
determines.
Well,
So,
it was to kind of stick
sorry,
on the
Alex,
same
go ahead,
topic real fast, right? With Puritanism and a lot of Protestantism, to go back to 2 episodes ago where we had Dr. Porco on and we talked about orthodoxy in the secular age. One of the defining traits of the secular age is the idea of reform, right? Everything is about reform and utopianism. And the Puritans are the kind of the apogee of this this kind of Christian reform movement where we must make heaven on earth, we must reform, we must follow all the rules, and we're the chosen ones, and we're going to reshape the country. We're going to reshape the political and the civil world into this ideal utopian like system, right? Which is kind
we're
of
going to build God's kingdom in America, because obviously the Europeans have failed, and we're coming to the new world, and we're going to do it ourselves.
There were all separatists, and they in Europe, they did stuff like Munster, where they broke away and created, there was this very millenarian end of the world kind of mindset to them a lot. And there are also a lot of kind of a biblical rebirth kind of mindset where you have episodes where some of these Puritans and like reformist Protestants consider themselves the reincarnation of King David, and they're going to create, the new Israel upon earth and Zion on earth. And, they start murdering people and doing all kinds of crazy shit. There's this very a cult-like extremism through Protestantism that is represented by the Puritans. And that's where you get a lot of like the crazy witch burnings in Salem. You get a lot of this stuff comes out of this like purity spirals and kind of excessive sola scriptura reading and constant separatism, and a lot of the accusations that modern contemporary people put towards the church, right? Whether it's the Roman Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church or even other Protestant churches, really, when they're talking about like their kind of extremism towards women and witches and that kind of stuff, they're really talking about modern era, Enlightenment era Puritans and reformist Protestants, because that's where you get these purity spirals like the witch trials and the abolitionists came out of this. And if you look at John Brown's history himself, he saw himself as on a mission from God, and he saw himself as a Moses figure that was going to lead an army of liberated slaves and liberated and pro freedom whites against the evils of the South and remake the United States in his kind of New England Puritan image. So there's a very like messianic kind of mindset to people like this that gets ignored in our history, to be honest.
I have a question.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I have a question. Joseph Smith and the Mormons, those guys grew up out of Missouri, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
They originated in upstate New York.
They're New Yorkers. They're New
right?
Yorkers.
That's right.
They
And then
moved
they
to
moved
Missouri
out
later.
west.
Yeah.
When was that? Was that around this same time? Because I remember they had a series of violent episodes in Missouri, and then eventually moved out to Salt Lake and settled.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's going to be my next series.
No kidding. Perfect.
Yeah.
Do you feel that it's in any way related to what's going on with this Kansas thing?
Well, funny you should ask.
Oh, nice. Here we go.
There was a secret society of abolitionists in Kansas called the Danites.
Yes, I've heard of these people. I don't
And
remember them, but I've heard of them.
and that group, as it existed in Kansas, was kind of patterned after the Mormon Danites, who were like the Mormon militant wing in
That's
Missouri in
right.
the
That's
1830s.
right. Yeah.
So like there's weird connections. I've been finding weird connections all over the place between, the border war and Mormons, which is kind of funny. Like I don't know. I'll know more about it once I research Mormons, but yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
the
That'll be fun.
Mormon like Battlestar Galactica Pilgrimage West, because that's what it basically was, right? Took place about 20 years prior to what we're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, they were
okay.
in Missouri in the 1830s. Bleeding Kansas is in the 1850s, so about 20 years before.
Huh.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's fascinating because you're absolutely right, Jason. Like there is the Mormons have their fingers in so much of 19th century Western United States history. Like you see them kind of involved in most Wild West kind of stories, and they're all over the place. They're all over the place in California. Actually, there's Mormon Rock in Southern California. They're involved in the whole Donner Pass thing. There's a lot of stuff, and if you are a fan of like mid-century black and white Wild West movies, right? A lot of those movies are actually unmentioned, but they're about Mormons, right?
Hmm.
Like the famous one called Wagon Train. I don't know if you heard of the Wagon Train.
Yeah.
It's one of the first like really good John Wayne movies, early ones. That's about a Mormon expedition. It's about
No.
because they would hire gun runners and stuff and cattlemen to escort their Mormon wagons heading west.
You know, do you know why that's horrible, Alex?
Hmm.
Because Gene Roddenberry described Star Trek as wagon train in space. Oh no. Oh no.
Well, I mean,
God damn it, Joseph Smith, the whole way back.
I mean, the church itself, the Mormon church, is very much another utopianist kind of.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna ask Jason when you're doing this research, man. An interesting question is: Are the Mormons the most successful of the Puritan utopian cults?
They might be.
I mean, my parents were just out there.
They come out of the
ago,
same
and
because they come out of the same area. Like
yeah, it's kind of the
Second
same
Great
ethos
Awakening,
almost.
like that era, like early
And
1800s.
it's New England, it's New York. That's basically Massachusetts.
The Unitarian Universalists come out of that too.
Oh yeah.
A whole bunch of weird Protestant offshoots come out of that.
Huh.
Just for the note, though, we're saying this, the Mormons aren't Trinitarian Christians, right? They don't believe in the Trinity, so they're not.
No.
They're not Christians in what you would say as the definition of Christians if we define Christianity as a belief in a Trinity, in which they don't have that belief. So they're beyond heretical from the perspective of, for example, the Orthodox Church or the Roman Catholic Church. And if you really get into their deeper beliefs and you read their theology, it's really out there. It's
really wild.
The Mormons have been on a 30 to 40 year kind of like campaign to muddy the waters about what they believe from the outside, to where they've managed to associate themselves with mainland Protestantism in a way. And, people like Mitt Romney and that type of thing, where you're like, oh, he's just, they're almost like they portray themselves as kind of, big tent Christians, but they're absolutely not at all. You would not recognize the theology if you read their stuff. Some of it is interesting but very out there, very science fiction-y, and it's kind of a mindset.
Ronald Reagan in the streets, L. Ron Hubbard in the sheets.
Yes.
Is that kind of what's going on?
That's that's a very good way. That's a very good way of putting it. They're very like that, because they portray themselves as, oh, gee golly, good, Wild West Americans.
Golly Willikers. Golly Willikers. Let me introduce you to
Yeah,
by
and then you go
65
into the
wives.
temple, you're
Wait,
like, oh,
what?
so when I die, I'm going to get my own planet? Well, that's interesting theology there, Joseph Smith. You know what I mean? Right? But there's some very interesting characters in the history of the Mormon church, you know. Brigham Young is very interesting, and I forget the name of his Brigham Young's like little enforcer. Oh, I forgot what his name is.
You know,
Yeah. This
you know
guy
what we're
was
gonna have to, you know what we're gonna have to do is I know we have a few Mormon listeners, and there's a few. Actually, you guys would be surprised. There's a few Mormon posters that are kind of in our little Shire Stack kind of circle, like who comment on my stuff, and like they're super nice guys. But it'd be fun to get one of them on here and just be like, all right, what's the deal?
Oh,
Just
one of my closest friends,
have the
one of
conversation.
my closest friends in my 20s and stuff. I love her. She's great, you know.
Yeah,
Is a Mormon, and I ended up learning a lot about Mormonism from
man,
her.
that's crazy.
She's a fallen away Mormon, but their history is fascinating. They, you know, and they're very much, if you are into the kind of contemporary science fiction world, the strangely enough, the contemporary like science fiction and fantasy like author world is very much dominated by Mormons. The guys that wrote that science fiction series you like,
The Expanse.
Expanse, that they're Mormons.
Are they? Well, I mean, the Mormons were in it.
Yeah, they're Mormons, and that's why the
That
Mormons
because
are
they're
in
more.
it.
Oh no.
Then you got Battlestar Galactica, right?
Yeah, Battlestar
Yeah.
Galactica is kind of a Mormon retelling. What's his name? Um, what's his name? Brandon Sanderson, that I've never read, but a lot of people that are into fantasy have read all the Brandon Sanderson stuff. He's a Mormon. Larry Correa, who a lot of like kind of right wing fantasy dudes like, he's a super Mormon. Just there's a huge like LDS church presence for some reason. They like to become science fiction authors, accountants, and CIA, FBI agents for some reason. It seems that the State Department and the FBI is very much dominated by dudes from Brigham Young, you know?
Yeah,
And
you remember that movie? What was that movie called? The Sound of Freedom? About
yes,
what department was that guy from? Some Fed, like, you know, rescuing kids. Like that Jim Caviezel is the actor's name. But I don't know if the guy he was playing was a Mormon, right?
right. So
Yeah.
the
Jim
Fed
Caviezel's not a Mormon.
the feds are very much heavy into, you know, Fed stuff. You know, a lot of Mormons into Fed stuff, and I think the reason why is specifically during the Cold War, because of their kind of close knit. You know, kind of straight laced, you know, don't drink, don't do caffeine, don't do the drugs, you know, that kind of stuff. Don't do the stuff. They were very good at being kind of, kind of G-men in a way, because they were very resistant to, um, they were very resistant to like Soviet KGB and like Chinese honeypot type operations, because you really can't you couldn't blackmail them because of their kind of perfection. And they're also very good for the CIA, because Mormons are very big into doing those missions that they do. They're like 2-year missions when they're young. They go all over the world and, you know, knock on people's doors and stuff, right? So that kind of skill set that they took makes them very suitable for, you know, CIA work, State Department work, kind of you know, going around door to door, right, and like becoming friends with people. So they have a lot of like connections, and they're a very interesting group of individuals, to be honest.
Hmm.
But we
Yeah.
sidetracked, and let's go back to Kansas.
Right.
Yeah,
So
how do we get on
John
that
Brown's
sidetrack?
John
John
Brown's
Brown,
about to
right?
murder a bunch of folk. There
Yeah.
you go.
So let's see, where were we? So yeah,
Uh,
that's John Brown's background anyway. Like
yeah, so he's kind of sucking around Kansas basically while this is going on.
well, yeah, so actually he had 5
Okay.
sons with him in
Oh, wow.
Kansas. And first of all, this is a weird thing. John Brown was married twice. His first wife died after giving him like 7 kids or something. And then he had a second wife who he married when she was 16 and he was 33. Like, you know, kind of weird. but maybe not as out of the ordinary back then as it would be now. Um, but she gave him 13 more kids. So this dude was like, raising his own army, like 20 kids. And I know some of them died in childhood because that was pretty common back then. But anyway, he had 5 adult sons with him in Kansas, and they actually went there first and were writing to him about the situation with, the two parties going at each other. And eventually he said, "I got to get involved in this," and he went out there. But he was in Lawrence during the Wakarusa War, and he was disappointed that it didn't, pop off. Um, and then later, when Lawrence was sacked, he got a bunch of his boys together and was on his way to go resist because nobody else was resisting. So he's like, "We're going to go fight these guys." But by the time he was still on his way there by the time it was all over. So he didn't make it in time. Um, so then after he didn't make it in time, he was still like, I got to kill somebody. So so he went so he went back towards his home near Oswatami. And this is the real like inciting incident for Bleeding Kansas. Like this is where it really goes down. He went back to the Potawatomi Creek is what it's called. He went to in the middle of the night, went to these people's homes. He picked out 5 pro-slavery people, settlers down there, pulled them out of their homes in the middle of the night and murdered them. And it was brutal murders. Like they were hacked up with swords. He and his sons were carrying broadswords. They were hacked up with swords. They were shot in the head, like brutal murders. And these were people who had no part in the sack of Lawrence, right? Uh, um, they just happened to be in the wrong party politically. Um, and this was like deliberate terrorism. And for me, what people always talk about with John Brown, at least when I was in school, they'd have this debate over his slave insurrection and whether it was right or not. Because everybody assumes that it was a good cause, but he might have gone too far and committed too much violence. And the question it becomes like, when is violence okay to support a noble goal, right? But to me, the real like obvious evil is this. Like it's the Potawatomi massacre. Like this is way less excusable than the Harper's Ferry raid in my mind. Um, not that I also don't think the Harper's Ferry raid is excusable, but this is even less so. This was just deliberate like terrorism, political terrorism, pulled people out of their homes in the middle of the night and hacked them up. And it was and this is what really touched everything off in Kansas.
Hmm. What's the rest of the country thinking about all this at the time?
Well, it depends what part of the country you're in.
Yeah, well, it's funny that you say that because I'd love to hear your perspective on both parts of the country or whatever part of the country. But it's like people talk about with the current political discourse. These two sides of the question are beginning to inhabit their own realities.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's
Oh
absolutely
boy.
right. Yep.
Yeah. So what about the rest of the country? What's going on? I mean, frame it however you want, but I imagine pro-slavery and pro-abolition are probably the easiest categories, right?
Yeah. Well, the reason so the parallels to modern progressives are all over the place. One of them is that the abolitionists are, I think, the reason they won in the end in Bleeding Kansas is because they were way better at propaganda than the Southerners were.
Hmm.
They had the newspaper offices in the territory. They had all these connections to the press back in the Northeast. And that's kind of what was driving public opinion in the North. So in the North, you're getting the abolitionist view of things. Um, and the Southerners in Kansas, like the Missourians in Kansas, are kind of trying to do the same thing, but they're not succeeding at it nearly as much. Um, but you are getting this like uh, kind of like polarized view of things where both sides are like you said, like both sides are living in their own reality. And actually, around this time, like around the same time as the sack of Lawrence in 1856, is when the caning of Charles Sumner happened on the floor of Congress. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yeah.
So the Preston Brooks, senator from, was it South Carolina?
Yeah, South Carolina.
Yeah. So he, this Charles Sumner made this speech that was like, saying some really inflammatory things about Southerners and their support for slavery. And Preston Brooks got up and beat him almost to death with a cane on the floor of Congress. Um, so that was, things were tense in the rest of the nation too, right?
Yeah. Talk shit, get hit, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing. I'm looking at the Wikipedia and looking at all these pictures. Southern chivalry argument versus clubs, and just smacking the hell out of the dude.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's interesting, and I think this is where we have to pause real fast and throw the disclaimer, right? We were talking about this in a historical way, and we're not taking the sides of pro northern states or pro southern states or slavery versus not slavery, right?
I mean, I'm taking the side of the South. I got to be honest.
Right. Maybe, Jim, but we're talking about history here from a historical standpoint. I don't like John Brown whatsoever. He's a terrorist, and I don't even believe that his goals. If you spend a little bit of time reading about him, I don't believe that his goals were truly about abolitionism. Well, I'm sure he truly believed in abolitionism.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, he saw himself as a Moses figure, and he was I think his self-image. The guy wanted to kill people, and the guy wanted to be in charge of people and kill people, which is very similar to a lot of kind of progressive kind of mindset where they might spout their ideals, which all sound good on paper, but they really just want to be in charge of shit, right? Kind of like the communists. I personally, obviously, I am not a pro-slavery person at all, and I think that slavery is a not good thing. From, I guess you can look at it. I can make whether it's a contemporary secular argument or a Christian argument against it. Now, the Civil War is a very complex, very interesting thing. I think one of the reasons, one of the problems with the political kind of, how you said that the northern anti-slavery crowd had better propaganda, is because their propaganda was easier, to kind of portray as kind of a freedom thing, kind of a liberation, kind of a theological thing.
Utopia.
While the Southerners,
well, and it fits in with American founding ideals. It's easy to make that case, like all men are created equal and endowed by their creator and all that.
Yeah, just real quick with that segue that you took there, just explaining. I want to make sure you guys know I'm on the side of Pope Urban II in this whole thing. I think we need to unite and retake the Holy Land for Christ. So that's where I'm at on the whole thing.
Nice.
So we're clear.
I just think that, Protestants fighting Protestants is just not my concern, to be honest, except from a historical kind of perspective. But ultimately, the Southern argument in the Civil War is multifaceted, from a states' rights to a economic one, and it's very interesting, and it's dumb and simplistic to portray it in this, like, the North good because they wanted freedom for everybody, and the South evil because they wanted slavery. That is just stupid. And as a European looking onto the Civil War, which I don't have historical blood ties to 19th century United States. I don't even have them through family, because I believe my wife's family is Ellis Island era immigrants. I don't even have that, so I don't have the connection to it. So I have a very historical top down kind of mindset. But what you do see in the abolitionist movement and in the northern kind of movements, you see very much similar kind of radicalism that is very much similar to the radicalism in Europe around the same time, which is, for example, in Eastern Europe, in like Russia, you have the serf liberation kind of movements and the violence that kind of went on in the very same way. You have John Brown-like figures in Russia around the same exact time that
Yep.
would murder people and do that type of thing for serf liberation, which eventually
Yeah.
grew in, especially in Germany, eventually grew into Marxism and communism. And it's very interesting parallels between the old world and the new world, and these kind of explosions of violence in support of radical ideology, often based in Christian Protestantism, which is very fascinating from a historical perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. You had the revolutions of 1848, just a couple of years before stuff started to pop off in Kansas.
Yeah,
Right.
and
And it's like,
interestingly enough, you can find guys in the Kansas Free State movement who are veterans of those revolutions.
oh no, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's wild.
Yep.
That fits really well with your analogy from the beginning of the podcast, Alex, where you have veterans from Spain in both the Soviet and German armies. And then later on, I remember when the Paris, not Paris, when the French resistance really popped off. Because if do you guys know the Paris of the French resistance, World War II? Like, do you know that like why they started popping off with violence?
No,
It was
not really.
it was the Germans really starting to crack down in France. And then it was a bunch of communists who had served in Spain going, yeah, we know how to deal with these guys. And then they just started killing people.
Right.
Mm.
Well, you see,
So
you
it's
see this
like,
thread.
whoa.
You see this thread. So John Brown's thing was that the abolition movement was not extreme enough. That was his whole
Yeah,
thing, right? That was his shtick in a way.
right.
It was, these guys want freedom for the slaves, but why aren't they killing people? Like his
So
view
he's a
was like,
19th century troon, is basically what we're saying here.
in a way, right? He wanted
Huh.
he wanted violence. He wanted actual overthrow of the southern states and the southern way of life, right? And he wanted violence, right? He was plotting, his Harper's Ferry stuff long before it actually happened, right? He was
Right.
collecting money, he was collecting guns, he was, and he got turned down by a lot of abolitionists, right? It's very important to note this, right? That a large majority of abolitionists did not want anything to do with this dude, right? Because he was an extremist by, even their standards, and they were radicals by everybody else's standards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That massacre that he committed with his sons, was that just practice?
Yeah, kind of. I mean,
Yeah.
the thing about him though was he it turns out he wasn't very good at fundraising. Like, I think I don't know. I kind of I started talking about him in the second part of my podcast, and I kind of hyped him up a little bit. And later, as I went along, I kind of regretted hyping him up as much as I did, um, because I don't think he's actually that impressive of a human being. I think he's a radical who met the right people who turned him into a martyr and a public figure through their media connections. But yeah, he was planning something like that for a long time. And actually, the
Hmm.
Harper's Ferry thing was, if you hear what he said, what he would write people, what he would talk about in the years leading up to that, um, his his plan was to have like a guerrilla army in the Alleghenies, and have like almost like an underground railroad thing where they would kidnap slaves and or rescue slaves as they would think of it, and take them to
Yeah.
freedom through the mountains. Um, and then actually I'll save that. But so the whole Harper's Ferry thing, I think is not what it appears, and but we can get to that in a minute.
yeah, why don't you continue with Kansas? Because I
Yeah.
diverted too much.
Yeah. Well, let's see, where were we? So the
There's
Potawatomi massacre goes
massacre,
down.
yeah.
And so after that, it's like there's all this violence in the summer of 1856. Like most of it happens in the summer of 1856, and it's kind of like there's a bunch of little incidents and things that go on. Um, and it's kind of like you can listen to my podcast if you want all the details on it, but um, what happens is ultimately the Free Staters win. Um, they gain political power again. They take over the government, and they end up pushing the after 1856, the things settle down a little bit. But actually in the summer of 1856, it's like there's full blown, battles, like field battles,
Hmm.
with hundreds of men involved sometimes. Um, One of them's the Battle of Osawatomie is a famous one, which John Brown was involved in. Um, his one of his sons got killed there. Um, but after 1856, the Free State Party kind of comes to power politically. They gain back control of the government officially, and then they start pushing pro-slavery settlers out. Like they start pushing them back into Missouri. Um, and this is where, like later in the period, after 1857, like you get into 1858, 59, this is when the jayhawking, like you've heard of jayhawkers, that's what Kansas University is named after.
Hmm.
Um, that's when that stuff gets started. Um,
I actually don't know what that is. If you don't want to, can let me know because I never heard
yeah,
that term.
yeah. So Jayhawkers, well, Kansas University's mascot is the Jayhawks. They're the college in Lawrence where all this stuff originated, kind of. But Jayhawkers back then were nominally free state bandits, basically, like gangs of outlaws. Well, again, it depends on how you look at it. They wouldn't have thought of themselves as outlaws, but they would go across the line, go across the Missouri line into Missouri, uh, and sometimes free slaves and take them back to Kansas, but they would always um, rob Missourians, basically. Like, and you get kind of a spectrum where some of them are actually ideologically abolitionists, and they're actually in it to free slaves. Some of them are just kind of using this whole situation to as an excuse to go rob people.
Imagine that.
Like
That never happens.
you get all kinds. Like
Yeah.
some people are actually dedicated to their ideology. Other people just see, oh, this is chaos. I can make a buck for myself. You
Let's,
know,
let's looters.
yeah, yeah. So that's when that stuff gets started. And actually, before John Brown went back east to Virginia, he was involved in one of those. Like he only did it once, um, but he crossed the line into Missouri and freed some slaves and took them back north.
Hmm.
That's interesting.
Well, yeah. A lot to think about. This is do we want to continue more with other Kansas things? I do. I've formulated a question in my mind that I want to ask you guys
Go for it.
before we wrap up, though. I don't know if necessarily now's the right time to ask it, but I could certainly do so if you want. You just want to go for it?
Well,
Yeah, unless you want
yeah,
to save
just
it for the end.
go for it. We'll wrap up because I think that your podcast, man, it's fascinating, right? And I think that anybody listening today should go and listen to
Yeah.
all the episodes because I'm going to go listen. I listened to the first one already and I really liked it. I'm going to listen to the whole thing now because this is an area of history I've never studied and I'm fascinated to hear the details of it. So I guess we can wrap it up so we're not spoiling the whole thing and see how it ends and see the details of it. So go ahead,
Yeah.
Fisto, ask your
Yeah, that's
question.
a good
Well,
idea.
actually,
Yeah, so
before
yeah, go
can
ahead,
I
Jason.
just interject one thing? So
Yeah.
I've hinted at this already, but just before we wrap up, John Brown, this is you can hear the details of this if you listen to the podcast, but I think that um, if you look at the details of what went down at Harper's Ferry and what he actually did there, from a military perspective, it makes no sense at all. Like he's either totally incompetent, like has no idea what he's doing there. He makes decisions that are just total nonsense. If he's actually trying to start a slave revolt and actually wants to succeed, um, but this is kind of my read of it. And I got some of this from a book called A Disease in the Public Mind by Thomas Fleming. Um, but the conclusion that I came to is that I think he was not really trying to start a slave revolt. He was trying to be a martyr. And I think he went into it intending to die in the attempt.
Hmm.
And you can
Hmm.
see it later, like, because, after he gets captured, um, he's in jail for a while and he has a lawyer advise him to use an insanity defense, like plead insanity, and you might be able to get off with life in prison or something. And he says, no, I don't want to do that. And he doesn't go for that. He refuses attempts of his followers to try to rescue him from prison. And, he ends up going to the gallows pretty resolutely. And I think that was his game the whole time.
Right.
Yeah.
Because
Considering, sorry, go ahead.
he expected to trigger, well, at least on paper, the idea behind it was that he was going to trigger a mass slave revolt, and he was going to have, anti-slavery whites also join in. And unfortunately for him, neither whites nor slaves joined in any of this stuff. They basically just kind of bounced as soon as he got there and
Right.
kind of abandoned him. And the whole thing was kind of a dud, but it was a massive propaganda coup for the abolitionists and the Northerners against the South, because he did become a martyr, and he was used as a martyr figure in the abolitionist movement.
Yeah, and he almost seems like he goes into Harper's, and if you look at where Harper's Ferry is, it's kind of on the border between North and South. Like, it's not deep South, and it's an industrial town, like more industrial than usual for a southern town. Um, and the population there was not there were not very many slaves or slave owners in Harper's Ferry, and so John Brown, it seems like he went in there kind of expecting people to be on his side. I call it ideology brain. Like, he thinks that because they're not super dedicated to slavery, that they'll be okay with him just coming in and doing his thing, which makes
Yeah.
no sense from an outsider's perspective, because it's like, okay, you show up in my town and start killing people, like, yeah, we're gonna fight you. Like,
Yeah.
who cares
He
what
spent
our
too much time on the
ideology
internet.
is? Yeah,
Yeah. Too much time on the internet.
yeah.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. So that kind of segues nicely into what I was thinking about. So, like, the whole American Civil War, it's a complicated event, and in no way do I want to try to attempt to, synthesize what happened or understand what happened. I mean, I'm not an expert, and I'm not the guy to ask, but based on the conversation we've had here, I can see Kansas and this whole situation as a very interesting thing to research because of how these things occur. And what I mean is, Kansas is it's the frontier at the time, right? It's the frontier. And people are moving into that frontier, and they're bringing their own ideas of how we should then live. And those come into conflict. And because both sides inhabit their own reality, there's only one way to settle it: with the barrel of a gun, eventually. Agree? So I look at the 21st century, and this is called the information age, right? When did the information age begin? When did that become like the thing? Do you guys have any notion? I want to say like the 90s,
The
maybe.
90s. I was thinking the 90s.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
kind of when people started saying that. So the information age, what's the frontier now? And you'd have to say it's probably the internet, not because it's a physical place that we're moving into, but it's a social place that we're spending our psychic energies on, or that we're putting our limited time on Earth into, right? That's the frontier. So you have all these different groups and all these different people moving in, and on the internet, I mean, gosh, when people got to America and thought you could be whatever you want, and like, you got Mormons and Joseph Smith moving halfway across the continent to set up their own version of heaven. I mean, the internet is the best version of that we've created ever, right? You guys kind of follow where I'm going with this?
Right.
Yeah.
So I wonder if how well well does what happened in Kansas map to what is currently happening in the United States, but specifically with the internet? And the one thing I'll throw into this is I don't want to be too like online faking gay about it, but I think there is an element of real to it. It's just the real side of it hasn't spilled over into, most of us are kind of like the people at Harper's Ferry going, who the hell is this guy? What are you doing? What? There's that's the vast majority of what you might call normies. While guys like us, like we're at least aware of John Brown. You know what I mean? Like we're like the Henry David Thoreaus or like the the guys in the discourse. And like we know there's probably people like this out there.
Thoreau was a big fan of John Brown.
Yeah, all right. So, is there like a John Brown out there now? What does that look like? Am I full of shit? Like, I don't know. What do you guys think about what I'm trying to say?
Maybe Mangione.
Well, yes, in a way, yes, but I think yes and no, right?
Okay.
And I feel like it doesn't map as well as some of us would like it to, in a way, right? Because, first of all, the Civil War, at the time of the Civil War, we are talking about unexplored, not unexplored, but undeveloped territory in the United States, right?
Yeah.
Like
right.
Manifest Destiny was at its, was happening, and we were going west. And I mean, the Civil War, California became a state in 1949, right?
Right.
And this stuff is all new, right? Everything's new everything, right? The country itself was defining itself at that time. So the other issue you had is you did have the issue of slavery. Slavery was a real, tangible thing, right? That was an issue that was left undecided during the Revolutionary War and the early constitutional conventions. But that issue, kind of raged in the back of the minds of a lot of people decades, many decades.
Yeah, before the revolution even.
Yeah, before the revolution. So there was issues that were, in a way concrete and factual, right? In today's kind of situation, the internet in a way is the battleground to a certain degree, but it's an ideological battleground because it's not really clear what the people are even believe. Like it's very hard to pin down what, for example, a lot of the left progressive kind of mindset is, because they have ideology, but their ideology is completely separated from the reality. You have these guys, that are democratic socialists. Like, for example, the guy that won that election in New York. I forgot his name. I can't pronounce it.
Zoran, some or other.
Yeah, Mondi or something like that, right? Well, he's a socialist, right? But the guy's a billionaire from a billionaire family, right? He's not a proletariat, leading proletariats, right? All these guys that are his supporters are all rich New Yorkers, basically, So their fantasy is very much divided from their reality on the ground of the normal working man and that type of thing. And they're not arguing over legitimate, like, local issues to a certain degree. A lot of it is like, and then on the right, you have the same kind of mindset, we have a problem of defining what we're actually arguing about. So in a way, there's no, these guys in Kansas, they were arguing about, actual concrete economic systems that that would affect their life, There
was land to fight over. There was actual real land to fight over.
Right.
What are we fighting over now? I don't know.
Right. It's digital space or, so there's
and there's the issue itself, and then there's the next level of it, which is the fact that everybody's fighting over it. Because even if you're not interested in that issue at all, if you're in Kansas, like you just went there because you wanted to farm, whether you're interested in the issue itself or not, there's people fighting over it in your backyard. So you have to deal with it.
Right. Well, did the pro-slavery side in the Kansas situation, did they actually own slaves? Were there slaves in Kansas?
There were some, but most pro-slavery people did not own slaves.
Right. See, so it's interesting because it's very ideological on both sides, you know?
Yeah.
And one side, there was probably no plantations. We're not talking about the deep South, like, you know, South Carolina with, you know, tons of plantations, or, you know, Virginia and these kind of states, right? We're
Yeah,
talking
correct.
about a more what you would imagine as a prairie state, Wild West kind of situation, right? So there's probably no cotton plantations, indigo plantations, or any of that kind of stuff in Kansas. So these guys weren't liberating slaves left and right, you know, when they were fighting. They were basically fighting other white dudes, you know, over political representation, really. So
Yeah,
it's
and funnily enough, some of the disagreement over the state constitution when it was being forged was the fact that the free staters, some of them wanted to put a provision into the constitution that prohibited blacks from living in the state.
interesting,
Yeah,
right? Interesting, right? So there, like I said, there's some, and I think where you can find the parallels to answer your question, Fisto, is in the mindset, right? In the
Yeah.
mindset of these kind of radicals, right? Where a lot of them think that there needs to be a next step, which is violence, right? Violence and punishing people that are almost not connected, right? For being not connected. And you see that in a lot, you know, in the kind of violence you saw during, you know, during like the Black Lives Matter situation where, you know, you got people yelling at people at restaurants and stuff, right? Like, what the hell do those people have to do with the police, you know, or where you're guilty by association because you're not on our side, you know?
Right.
And you have which is a very, like I said, back to that, it's a very purity spiral, right? Where
Yeah.
you're either on our side and you 100% affirm our beliefs, or you're the enemy, therefore you deserve violence, right? And this is the mindset you see. It's not just about you living your own life. It's about you will basically be on our side or you deserve death, right? And this is the extremist kind of version. In our more contemporary cases, you deserve, you know, cancellation,
Yeah.
violence, destruction of property, and that
Doxing.
kind of stuff, right? And
yeah,
and that's where I think you do see the parallels, not so much as that, but as in the mindset. And you have a example of very cruel, very violent people adopting a humanitarian tinged kind of mindset where we're doing the right thing and the right thing needs violence, you know? And I think that's where you can get the true parallels. And you see that in communist uprisings, right? Like you see that in the Spanish Civil War, right? The worst atrocities and violence were caused by the diehard communists who had no problem murdering people because they were trying to escalate a pushback from the more passive, you know,
Yeah, that was the
Republican
point.
side. Right. That was
Yeah.
the point. The point was we're going to force we're going to commit atrocious acts of violence in order to force the opposite side to commit violence also, so shit goes down, you know? And you see that
yeah.
in all these kind of terroristic kind of situations. And you know, I think that's where the parallels can be found without drawing moral equivalence or, you know, moral opinion from a historical perspective. So it's fascinating. And I think everybody should listen to the podcast. I find, you know, history is fascinating from a macro kind of level, right? We all learn macro history in high school and even in undergrad and college. But I think that's very fascinating to get into the deeper kind of levels of history, something like this, right? Where we learn about in detail about certain, you know, chunks, little tiny blocks of side conflicts. Because one, they're fascinating. Two, once you understand the implications and the ideologies at play, you can actually make more sense of the macro history at the next level. And that even carries, you know, through to all sorts of, you know, you can tie it into all sorts of greater trends in history, from religious history to ideological, political history. And that's why I find this, like, I don't know what you call it, this micro history fascinating, you know? So go ahead and listen to Mr. McGinty's podcast, guys.
Yeah, for sure.
What else? We're almost done. What else we got? What else you got for us, Jason? Any interesting stuff? What are your future plans for the podcast when you're done with Bleeding
Yeah.
Kansas?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me on. This has been a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
Good.
Um, but yeah, I already kind of gave away the next series. I'm gonna do one on the Mormons. Um, After that, who
Oh
knows?
yeah.
I don't know. Like this, I mean, I've been, I think I released, I'd have to go back and look, but I think I released the first episode of this in September of last year. And, I was doing research for that for like a year and a half before that. So, and here we are. I still got a couple more to go on this one. I'm actually the latest one that I've been recording is taking us up through about the middle of the war, 1863, middle of 1863. So I'm gonna have a couple more episodes on that, and then start reading about Mormons, and that'll probably last me another 3 or 4 years, to be honest.
Amazing.
So
Amazing.
who I haven't thought far enough ahead to know what comes after that.
Um,
But I do, the reason I wanted to do the podcast was that, like, you're talking about history. Like, I wanted to delve into these things that not many people know about and, like, get into the nitty-gritty details of this stuff. Because, I think that history is not really about the past. It's about the present. It's about, like, figuring out where your people came from, like, who you are as a people, and how you became who you are now and where you end up going later. So, and I think you have to understand where you came from. Um, and that's what history is really about.
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to kind of change topics real fast as we're coming to and get about 10 more minutes before we max out our time. You, Mr. McGinty, right?
Yes.
Interesting about you is that, if you, it would be safe to say that if you were a listener to this podcast and you're listening to you speak about Kansas and everything, you'd assume you're a Protestant, but you're not a Protestant, right? You're
I'm not a Protestant.
you are part of the club, right?
Yes.
The Black Ibis Social Club Religious Club, right? So for those listeners that you guys all know because you all listen, Mr. McGinty is actually an Eastern Orthodox. How did a Kansan end up an Eastern Orthodox?
Well, um, I grew up Protestant. I grew up in a prosperity gospel word of faith church, if you know anything about that movement. Do you know about the word of faith movement?
No, I understand what prosperity gospel is, but I'm not familiar with the
Yeah.
specifics.
Well, it was you can look into it if you want, but it's kind of associated with a guy named Kenneth Hagin back in the mid 20th century. But anyway, yeah, this is my church was associated with that movement. Prosperity gospel, like hyper Pentecostal, speaking in tongues, all that stuff. Jumping up and down, all that kind of stuff. Um, and I don't know. I guess I shouldn't make this super long, but the short version is I got away from that. I was an atheist for a while. I had like an argumentative atheist phase in my early to mid 20s, and started coming back around. I actually, this is going to sound cringy now, but Jordan Peterson was kind of my gateway drug to orthodoxy because I found him, heard his biblical lectures that I think are still actually pretty good.
I agree with you.
But found I I think I found Jonathan Pageau through him. Started listening to his stuff on YouTube and got interested in the Orthodox Church. And then actually, this was a couple years ago at this point, or well, let's see, I've been married 2 years, so this would have been like 4 or 5 years ago. Um, a friend of mine said, "Hey, I got this girl you might want to meet, and she's Orthodox." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And that was when I was like, "Well, I've been interested in Orthodoxy for a while. Maybe I should actually go to church." So I did, um, and I ended up joining the church, and I'm also married. to the same girl. So
Amazing.
yeah. So yeah, that's kind of how I found it.
That we get a lot of criticism that orthodoxy in America tends to attract a lot of men, but I've actually seen the opposite. There's a lot of women that join orthodoxy as converts, and it's, like we talked with Dr. Porker 2 weeks ago, is that the modern world is just as damaging to women as it is to men. It's just that we kind of ignore women because they tend to be basically fawned upon in other elements, but that fawning itself is very harmful to them. Well, that's an amazing thing that you're now. What I was thinking, I was driving today, and I was thinking, because I do a lot of thinking when I'm driving, and not enough driving when I'm driving, which is terrifying to people that drive with me. But one of the criticisms from Protestants who have recently discovered Orthodoxy and have decided to try to come at us. There's a famous kind of podcast that attacked Orthodoxy recently, and it was kind of a big deal on X and stuff. And it worked against them, honestly, because they got trashed in all the comments.
Was that Joel Webbin?
Yes, Joel Webbin. Right.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right. And he had some nonsensical things, and it actually made him look worse, clown, but we're starting to get the eye of Sauron on us from both the liberal mainstream media and the Protestant right wing is coming at us now. One thing that's, Joe Webbin's argument, like the core of his argument, was mostly nonsensical, but the key was that, Orthodoxy is not American enough, not American enough, right? Well, my kind of my initial, it's interesting because I'm not American, right? I'm American in spirit, I guess, because I lived here all my life, and I love America. But I can't claim being an American, even though I'm an American citizen, a combat veteran. I did all the American good boy stuff. But I'm never going to claim that I'm an American. But my daughter is, and my wife is. But it's interesting because if you say that Orthodoxy is not American enough, well, that means that Christ is not American, right? Is Christ not American enough for you, Mr. Webbin? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right. And what's interesting is that Orthodoxy, which is the true church, the original church, right? It wasn't Roman enough either, right? And Romans didn't like it at first, right? And it wasn't, Dacian enough because those guys didn't like it. And it wasn't Russian enough because those guys didn't like it at first, But it became Roman, and it became Greek, and it became Russian, and it became all the different nations of Europe, right? And, it adopted, and it became adopted, and it became, because it's universal, right? And what's interesting, and I saw this firsthand, and this is one of those things where I was so... in a way fascinated, right? Because in a weird way, I too am. Sometimes I'm like, oh well, I put Orthodoxy in the Eastern European category in my own mind, or I used to for a long time, and I recently went to a very amazing, beautiful church in Charleston, South Carolina. And a lot of the guys, it was the most Southern thing I've ever seen, in South Carolina at an Orthodox church. These guys had violins, and they were doing a contra dance thing, and there was barbecue and all kinds of crazy, and they're wearing their little Southern Dixie kind of suits, And it was the most interesting thing because these guys all had these Charleston accents. And if you're not familiar with this South Carolina, there's a Charleston accent that's very, very different than a lot of the accents from other places. And, I was like, wow, this is interesting because it's got this, universal Orthodox thing mixed with this, Southern South Carolina vibe thing. And one of the people was joking about it, was like, yeah, we're Ortho Dixie guys, not Orthodoxy, right? And I was like, that's great. Because if you look at the Greeks have a very Greek version of Orthodoxy, right? Well, not a version, it's a Greek kind of manifestation flavor, right? And you get the Russians have their own thing with their onion domes and their Dostoevsky depression that they do. The Romanians are somewhere in between the Greeks and the Russians, where we're very depressed, but we also like to party a bit more than the Russians do, and the Serbs and everybody. And I think that Orthodoxy will become American, or Americans will become Orthodox, right? And it will adopt the flavors of it. And I've noticed that it's very popular in the South. And one of the things that shocked me moving to the South is like, wow, there's a lot of Orthodox churches in the South, Yeah. And if you listen to like podcasts and you listen to, a lot of the online commentary, all these guys are Southerners, and it's like Father so-and-so from, Virginia, Father so-and-so from, and I'm like, wow, like I never would have thought that, and what do you guys think about the claim that Orthodoxy is not American enough, and that's why it's never going to catch on?
Well, when I hear Protestants make that argument, what I always want to bring up is, well, imagine applying that same argument to Norse pagans, right? Like, would you say that a Norse pagan shouldn't convert to Christianity because it's not Norse enough? Like, you'd apply that to anything else, and it's like it doesn't make any sense.
No.
Like, of course, you're going to say, yes, you should follow the truth, even if it means going against the traditions of your ancestors in some ways. It's like, what do you care more about? Do you care more about the truth, or do you care more about holding to your traditions? And it's not to say that traditions aren't important, and Orthodoxy accounts for that in a lot of cases. It's like, it incorporates traditions of the peoples that it converts. It doesn't just like come in there and smash everything, right?
Right.
But the most important thing is to believe in the truth. So
right. What's interesting, because tomorrow after Vespers, we're having a 4th of July grill and celebration, at my church. That's what we're doing tomorrow. We're going to light fireworks and grill and celebrate America after Vespers, and I think that's really cool, because I think I might be the only foreign person at my church, which is, fascinating in my
You're
opinion.
Romanian, right?
Yes, I'm Romanian, yeah.
Yeah. So I have a quick story that you might appreciate. We have this sweet old Romanian lady in our parish, like little babushka, the kind of person that's the backbone of your parish,
Mm-hmm.
And so we have this back deck where people sit during coffee hour sometimes if the weather's nice. And so I didn't witness this, but I heard it from our subdeacon. One day he was out there on the back deck, and this family walks up, and he starts talking to them, and turns out they're Romanian. So he's like, "Oh yeah, we have this Romanian lady in our parish. Let me go get her real quick." And so he goes and finds her, and he says, "Hey, there's this Romanian family out here that just walked up to visit. You want to come meet them?" And the first thing out of her mouth is, "Are they gypsies?" and he said, and the subdeacon's kind of taken aback, and he's like, well, I don't know. Why don't you come talk to him and find out? So she goes out there, talks to him for a little bit, and comes back inside. She goes and finds the priest and says, "Father, they are gypsies. We give them no money. They are filthy gypsies. We give them plate of food, send them on their way. We give them no money." And she was just like, could not stand it. Like, I don't know if I don't know how common that is, but
that's pretty common.
Didn't like gypsies at all.
That's pretty common. It's pretty common, and I have no ill will towards her, if that makes sense. It's interesting because people go, well, why don't you go to Romanian Orthodox Church? Well, I don't, because I actually I'm a fan of the idea of the OCA specifically. I think that an autocephalous American church is what America needs, right? I think while we should totally respect the traditions of the different not denominations, the different expressions of the Orthodox Church, I think that ideally an American church with American leadership in America is the key, you know? So that's why I'm glad to be a member of an OCA church. But that doesn't mean that the other churches are bad in any way. I went to a Greek Orthodox church briefly when I was in California, and I think you should go to any Orthodox church, Antiochian or whichever ones. And well, you know what's interesting, because when we talk about tradition, right? And I think this is I was listening to a podcast today, and there was a priest on there. I'm going to misquote it, so I'm sorry. And I'll post it in the notes, but he had a very good point, you know, and the point was that, you know, when we talk about tradition, the American traditions, right? A church itself, the body of the church is a vessel for traditions, right? Traditions are what the people do, right? What the people do and what we do. And the church, the entity of the church is the vessel. And unfortunately, the vessel of Protestantism is not a very good vessel of tradition, right? Because you take somebody like you, Fisto, right? You've been in the you know, U.S. your entire family for, you know, since before the U.S. was an entity.
Since the before times.
Since the before times, right? Well, let's imagine that your mother or your grandmother, right, was a Protestant, right? And she went to church every Sunday, you know, when she was a little girl or a teenager, you know, even a young adult, right? Well, you take that grandma, and she's an old granny now. She's not going to find a church that looks anything like the church she went to back in the day, okay? A Protestant church, right? Because they've become, you know, they're completely a different church than they were in the 50s and 60s, right? They, you know, you have these guys that are like Episcopalian, right? Who in the 50s and 60s were very, very Anglican, very kind of traditionalist, you know. You have some elements of that, like in Home Alone, where they do the whole Christmas pageant thing, you know, if you guys remember that movie, right? I think that was a kind of an Anglican Episcopalian kind of thing, right? And then, you know, you have those guys kind of traditionalist, and they were to walk in, you know, if they went to church every day in the 50s and 60s and even the 70s, but they were to walk into an Episcopalian church in 2025, they would come face to face with rainbow flags and trans flags and women bishops, right? It would not be the same church that they grew up in, right? Yep. But if your grandmother was an Orthodox Christian, right, the church she would go to back when she was in the 50s and she walked into my church today, or the church you've been attending, Fisto, right? It would be the same thing, right? And you can prove this because you can come to my church this Sunday. You can drive up all the way from Florida to my church in South Carolina. And if you paid attention last Sunday, we would be doing the same exact thing, right? And I can go to Jason's, sorry, I could go to your church, right? And it would be the same thing, right? We would be the same kind of, the liturgy is the same, right? Jason's church, your church, and my church, with maybe cosmetic differences in the building itself and some of the icons based on the saints that we venerate locally, right? Might be different, but we're going to be doing the same thing, right? Jason would not
Alex,
be, huh?
Sorry, did you just invent the Black Ibis Social Club Orthodox Liturgy Tour?
Well, right,
Did you just invent that? I'm just throwing that out there.
We're gonna have to, you know, because I mean, I saw it. You know, I went to the Greek Orthodox Church in California before I moved out, right? And the liturgy with a few different things here and there, and some of the focuses on the singing is a little bit different in the Greek variations, right? It was the same thing, right? Like, you know, they both used John Chrysostom's. Did I pronounce it right? I'm always going to pronounce Saint Chrysostom's completely wrong, right?
Yeah, it's not chrysanthemum.
I know. Stop, guys. Leave me alone. I apologize. My wife is like always dogs on me for it because I always do when I talk fast, right? But it's the same thing, right? And you know what? I can guarantee you that you can take some Russian peasant from the 19th century, you know, straight out of a Dostoevsky novel, you know, and plop him right in the middle of our church. And, you know, first he'd be like, oh, what the hell? There's electricity. And you know, and he, you know, but they would know exactly what we're doing, right? And you could go back then, you could go 2,000 years now, and you could see, you know, what they were doing. It's the same thing, right? Well, maybe not 2,000 years because liturgy was around 300, but you can go, close to 2,000 years in the past, and it would be very, very similar, right? The Protestant churches cannot say that because every single decade they adopt and change and have radical revolutions within their own body, right? They're a church in flux. So they cannot talk about traditionalism, right? Because John Brown, right, would find the churches today abhorrent, right? You know what I mean? Like
Yep.
he would not. I guarantee you, the Puritans of Plymouth Plantation, right, the Pilgrims or whatever, would hate what American churches are today. But an equivalent historical figure from the same time as the Pilgrims or the Puritans from Eastern Europe, right, from Greece, would find an Orthodox church in the United States familiar. So what is the vessel of this traditionalism, right? And the question is, right, well, it's not my tradition, right? Well, it's not about me, right? It's actually about my daughter. Because if I'm going to take my daughter to church, right, I want her to be a member. Well, I want her to be part of a true church, right? That's the real thing, right? But practically speaking, right, I want her to go to a church that is going to be the same in 20 years and the same in 40 years and the same in 100 years, right? I want her to go to a church that she is going to recognize as the same church that she went to as a 7-year-old when she is an old babushka with her great grandkids. You know what I mean? And I want her to have that. And guess what? I'm sorry, Mr. Whatever. What was that guy's name? Webben or whatever. Your church is not going to be around in 100 years, but mine will, because it survived communism, it survived the Roman Empire, and it survived all sorts of trials and tribulations. It's not going to be there. I guarantee you that. You know what I mean? And if it is, it's going to look nothing like, what it looks like today, because it's going to have transhuman mutant flags or something like that on it, or whatever the fad of 100 years from now is going to be. But you know what? Mine is going to have the icons of the Theotokos in it, the same ones that we have today. And that's why I think that we're going to win and they're going to lose. But I don't want them to lose. I want it to be on our side. That's why I welcome everybody to join us. I don't know. That's my rant. What do you guys think?
Yes.
Not
Nice.
bad. I think I like the idea of a road trip visiting liturgies and different churches across the country. I feel like that's actually a great idea. Not even shitposting a little bit.
That would be awesome. Maybe maybe in a year or two when I retire from my current job and start a new one, which I'm planning on doing.
Yeah. Thanks to all of our paid subscribers.
Yeah.
You can finance the great Alex and Fisto.
Yeah, the great
Orthodox road trip.
American Orthodox pilgrimage across the United States. We'll be going around writing about it and podcasting about all the different churches we visit.
Yes. Is Orthodoxy American enough for America? That'll be the question that we answer. And it's American enough in much the same way that Christianity was Roman enough.
Right. In a way, right? Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's such a funny thing to say. It's like, it's not Roman enough. Yeah. And then Constantine the Great rolls up and is like, I don't know. Hold on there. Watch this. Oof. Right. Oh, never mind.
Yeah. But we're talking about people that are historically illiterate, so it's okay. But what do you guys think? Actually, because you do a history podcast, so you're a historian, and whether formal and informal, and you're a history teacher yourself, Fisto, right? Mm-hmm. What do you guys think? Why is Orthodoxy so attractive to Southerners? That's kind of an interesting thing. Why? I mean, look, it's big in Pennsylvania, right? But why is it so attractive to American Southerners? Because there's an interesting trend that I've noticed. And what do you guys think? So
that is an interesting question. I don't know if I have the best answer, but I do know that the South at the time of the Civil War was much less. They were descended from. They were mostly Methodist and Episcopal, which is descended from the Anglicans, right? So they were on the not radical Reformation side. So
Right.
there were less revolutionary, I think, than the Puritans were for sure. But I think it's probably a shorter jump from the moderate side of the Reformation to Orthodoxy than it is from radical Reformation to Orthodoxy.
Hmm. That's interesting. I actually
The word,
always go
sorry,
ahead, Vincent.
the word that popped into my head was aristocratic. Southerners to me always strike me as, they're well-behaved folk. They have their manners, and when you speak with one, like it commands a level of, for lack of a better word, authority. So
Hierarchical kind of.
yeah, hierarchy, authority, it's just that's what you do, and if you don't do it, they look at you like you're like you don't know the rules. Like, what are you doing? And I mean this as a compliment. Like, there's a sense of culture there that I think they recognize and naturally gravitate towards.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting, right? Like
Anyway,
as in joining something old as opposed
yeah,
to
exactly.
rebuilding or reinventing stuff, right? I
Yeah,
can see that,
game recognized game.
right? Because I mean, it's interesting that the most radical Christians in 18th and 19th century, well, 17th, 18th, and 19th century, kind of gravitated towards New England, and out of that, kind of movement, you have the more radical left kind of manifestations in the United States. I mean, the Northeast is kind of the home of all these very radical political movements in the U.S. And of course, the Midwest and the Middle South is the battleground of it. And those guys all moved to California, to the West Coast, like Washington State. But you do, you can look at Europe, for example, and the all the Protestant kind of radical countries in the 17th, 16th, 17th century are now the most atheistic countries in Europe. They were the most, radical. I don't know if those guys, the early Protestants like Luther and Calvin would be happy at what their Reformation brought upon their people, because I think they would have rather stayed Roman Catholics than become whatever the hell Germany is right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
the Dutch, whatever the hell they've become spiritually and religiously, with open prostitution and their insane kind of transgenderism and hyper liberalism. So it's fascinating, right? And I've always
Yeah.
wondered about the religious element. You don't really talk about the religious element as much in the Civil War, at least from a Southern perspective. I know that there is justification from slavery in some Southern religious kind of circles, but it doesn't seem like it's a big thing, Of course, you had the kind of Baptist kind of revivals in the 19th century and the 20th century in the South, right? Like your born again tent revivals are very Southern in style, and the whole Baptist thing comes out of the South. So it's interesting how that went away, and now this area is kind of ripe for conversion and adopting new to this area kind of religious movements. And I mean, maybe we'll have another religious reawakening in the United States, right? Some people are saying, you look at you mentioned what's his name, Jordan Peterson, right? Who I think a lot of us on the right are kind of mean to him, you know.
I
Uh,
mean, he earns it though.
he does earn it, but look,
You gotta eat. I don't think you can be crying on camera so much.
yeah, no, you're right. But I had a conversation with him with my priest, right? And I I really
Wait, you had a
really
you had
Hmm?
a conversation with Jordan Peterson?
No, about him with my priest, right?
Oh, okay, I got you.
My
My
priest
bad, I
actually,
misheard you.
my priest actually was on John Piaget's podcast. John Piaget did a whole thing on my priest actually, because he has an interesting kind of history, and he's a Southern Orthodox guy, and he converted from baptism, basically from being a Baptist, and I don't want to dox the guy, but he was kind of famous in Baptist kind of the scene before he converted to Orthodoxy. And John Piaget had him on his podcast a few years ago. But we talked about Jordan Peterson, and my kind of opinion is I liked, just like you said, like Jordan Peterson. I discovered him kind of at the tail end of my atheism, if that makes sense, right? Where I was really like looking for justifications for my I felt truth, and I felt like the reality that like maybe there is something more than just materialist atheism in the universe, in life. And when I started reading a lot about Jordan Peterson's early lectures and stuff, and his whole Pinocchio thing, and this was before his book even came out, before he like exploded with that interview he did where he owned that one interviewer, and it was a big deal. And Kathy Newman, right? And you know what's interesting about Jordan Peterson? In a way, you could take him as you can take him as a figure that, like, as a cautionary figure, right? He is a person. When you are an atheist materialist, right, and you are into scientism and all that stuff, right? In a way, you are protected because you've closed your mind to the metaphysical so much that you're kind of, while you deny the reality of the universe, because you're denying the reality of the universe because the universe is not strictly material, right? But that kind of denial, that kind of wall, that kind of shield you put on yourself protects you, right, from all the bad non-material things in the universe, in a way, right? Because you will deny Christianity, but you'll also deny, crazy Buddhist spirituality and, all kinds of occultism and that type of stuff. You kind of block it off, right? Of course, it seeps in there secretly, right? But you kind of build a wall that's kind of protects you. Your own materialist mindset keeps you safe. But Jordan Peterson broke down that wall in his own psyche, I think. But because he never replaced it with religion, he basically is overwhelmed, I think, with the spiritual, if that makes sense. He's a warning against the spiritual without the guidance of the church and tradition, right? That's what it is. Because when you open yourself up to the spiritual, and if you're not properly trained or not properly guided by, the church, right? A spiritual father, the 2,000 years of, knowledge and tradition, you end up, whatever the hell he ended up as, unfortunately, you know what I mean? Which is kind of a mess because he's open to the attacks from all angles now that he dropped his rationalist materialist mindset. And there is a danger to that. There's a danger of wading into some of the ideas that he wades into without the proper, like demons, the evil, powers of the world, they have no power against God, against Christ, right? But if you don't have Christ, you're powerless against them in a way. Right. And I have a feeling that's what's going on with him. And this is obviously mumbo jumbo speculation on my part, but I think it's a good explanation for what you're looking at him. So I don't see him as a pathetic figure. I see him as somebody that needs help in a way, and I hope that his friendship with Piaggio eventually brings him to the right place,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you can pray for him. I mean, it's good to pray for him.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think I totally agree. Like as far as like my own conversion, what he did was get me out of the pure materialism mindset. It's like he broke me out of that. And then, by the grace of God, I was able to replace it with, the true faith. Whereas he has not been able to do that yet. And yeah, he does look like he needs help.
A lot. We can't turn on him because I think he's done more towards bringing tons of young people into a non-secular mindset, and
many such cases.
Right. And so he is, God is working through him, or has worked through him 100%. And I think if you deny that, like, I think that's an unfair thing to say because, he has done good, he has done good. Unfortunately, he needs help himself, but I have a feeling he will eventually. Um, but it's speculating about people I don't know personally is it's kind of out there. But yeah, so I don't have any ill will towards him, and even some of the other kind of Orthodox converts like Rod Dreher and stuff. I mean, there's something about that guy that irritates the hell out of me, and I don't know what it is, but uh, he's doing his good in his own way, even though he's him, and some of his stuff drives me nuts, and he's Chicken Little about
I, s-
everything all the time.
I started reading some of his articles, and reminds me a lot of just like a cultural critic, like
Right. Well,
this
that's what he
the
is.
style in which he writes.
What?
Yeah, exactly. It just shines through. Reminds me of reading like that Ted Giora guy, or however you say his last name, the jazz dude,
Yeah.
or like I feel like I'm
Everything.
reading
That's what he is. I mean, he
like
wrote for the American
yeah.
Conservative, and everything is like a scandal. Everything's a scandal. Everything's like, oh, you're transing your
Okay.
kids and blah blah blah. And it's like, okay, man, calm down. Like,
American
yeah,
News Magazine style.
that's his vibe, and he's a
Okay.
boomer. And boomers be booming.
Yeah,
You,
whatever.
you can't help them.
Yep.
And boomers be
Boomers go booming.
booming. Dave Green got in it with him on an interview about a month ago, and I agree with Dave Green, even though Dave Green's a Roman Catholic, and I was like, oh, I'm going to take side of the Roman Catholic over the Orthodox convert because, like this dude irritates me sometimes, because he just does. But he has some good articles and he's got some good points, Um, but yeah, I think we had a wonderful conversation today, man. I wish we could keep going. I want you to come back on because I want to talk more about all this
Yeah,
stuff.
it's been a lot of fun.
Dude, I want you to finish this one and go into the Mormon one because while I find Kansas history fascinating, I
Yeah,
really
yeah.
do. I didn't know I found Kansas history fascinating, but now I do. I'm like, oh, now I know about Kansas, right? Just how I.
Yeah, well, honestly, another inspiration I had for doing this was Daryl Cooper with the Martyr Made podcast. I don't know if you ever
Mhm.
heard of that,
Oh yeah, I've listened to
Yeah.
some of
but
his stuff.
he did a series on Jim Jones and the People's Temple. And that was one of those things that I listened to that. It's like 30 hours long or something. And I've listened to that thing like 4 or 5 times all the way through. And I would never have been anywhere, interested at all in Jim Jones to learn that much about it. But I listened to that and I was thinking, I can do the same thing for other people about, bleeding in Kansas. People who have never been interested in it before, maybe they can find it interesting too.
Did you ever listen to Hardcore History before he became lame?
Oh yeah. Yep. I enjoy that a lot. I loved his
Yeah,
World War I series and his World War II in the Pacific series and the Eastern Front one.
right.
Yeah,
Me
I love
Yeah,
too.
that
the Eastern
stuff.
Front one was the one I got really into.
Yeah.
My favorite one of his is
He did one
actually
about Munster too.
I was about to say that was my favorite one actually, and that
Yeah.
when I listened to that series he did, uh, it triggered a deep dive into the Reformation and Protestantism for me, where like I got obsessed with it for a few years. Right, that's all I read about, because I
Mm.
really like I read a bunch of books on it that he used as sources, and I find that whole early modern wars of religion kind of era fascinating part of history that kind of gets brushed over right now, but I think that a lot of the contemporary cultural currents we have today started in that era specifically of Western Europe, and we're still kind of doing the Munster Rebellion over and over and over in different variations of it. I mean, you can do a direct parallel from the Munster Rebellion to the Waco stuff and the Branch
Mhm.
Davidians. I mean, you can connect Jim Jones to the Munster stuff too if you want to you want to jump there. Um, Fascinating side note: there is a museum in Savannah, Georgia, right down the street from me. It's a really weird museum. It's this dude, and he collects like serial killer memorabilia and weird shit like that, right? Like he's got like weird taxidermy, and he's got a bunch of his main collection is all the art of Wayne Gacy, like his weird clown like drawings and
man.
stuff he did in jail. He's got his jumpsuit. He's got Charles Manson's he's got Charles Manson's like sweatsuit from jail. He's got all kinds of crazy stuff, a bunch of Scientology documents and Scientology auditing machines, and just just nutso stuff, right? He also has this huge collection of horror themed pinball machines that are like, they're open for everybody to play with when you go in there. This place is evil, it's just got like a you go in there and you're like, ooh, this is gross, right? Like, he's got like Tanya Harding's like skate, like ice skate, just evil artifacts, man. It's like a reliquary of just evil shit, right? And one of the things he has in his room, right, is he's got a bunch of stuff from Jonestown. He actually has a pair of Jim Jones's sunglasses. He always wore those sunglasses. So he's got a pair of his actual sunglasses, and he's got actual like the packets, not the Kool-Aid, but the whatever Kool-Aid knockoff thing they used for the death juice and stuff, And he's got all that stuff, and it's just like, oh, it's gross. It feels like you need to go see a priest afterwards when you go to this place, because you need to get some holy water thrown on you, But it's interesting from a historical perspective. He's got what else else he's got? He's got a bunch of crazy stuff. He got a lot of Church of Satan stuff, and just evil stuff, and a lot of voodoo stuff from this area, because Savannah and stuff had a lot of the voodoo stuff in there. But yeah, the Jim Jones stuff is interesting. He's got the entirety of like the recordings. The dude did a lot of recordings. If you listen to I didn't listen to the episode on him, but you're probably familiar with him. He did tons of recordings, and there's tons of like audio tapes from Jim Jones and all those guys.
Yeah, he played a lot of that stuff in that series.
Yeah, real dark stuff, man. You're just like, and it in a way, it illustrates the fanaticism and the radicalism of these people, and the Jim Jones is fascinating because it's not so much he's not really that fascinating himself as an individual, but the reaction of his supporters, not even the ones that were there at Jonestown, but very like liberal Californians that kind of funded and supported him, and the political implications of that. In a way, like people always go, oh, Jim Jones, he's some crazy right-wing guy, but he wasn't. He was actually a crazy left-wing guy. And,
yep.
Right. And it's a very left-wing, kind of, emanation of the same kind of religious puritanism that you see in people like John Brown, for example. And so fascinating stuff from a historical perspective. Evil stuff if you look at it in real life, because it made me feel completely just unclean, basically, just walking through that museum. But yeah, a lot of connections. Once again, micro histories, fascinating stuff. All right, so we call it a night tonight. Mr. McGinty, thank you for joining us. We'll chat probably in our private chat. For you listeners out there, very important, guys, okay? I want you to like, share, and subscribe both the Black Ibis Social Club, Fisto's personal Substack, and Mr. McGinty's Substack called the Unsung Substack. I will link it and you'll find it. And go ahead and listen to the Kansas podcast, because it is fucking interesting, fascinating stuff. And please like, share, and chat about this, because I think it's just interesting to have an ongoing conversation about all the stuff we talk about. I wish we could talk about it for hours and hours and hours in real life, in person, over a beer or a glass of wine or whatever you guys like to drink. For next week's episode, like I said earlier in the show, Fisto and I are going to watch The Great Beauty. All right. It's a fantastic movie. You can rent it on Amazon for a few bucks. Please watch it. It's in Italian. So if you're illiterate and can't read subtitles, I apologize to you. Just look at it. You probably will get the gist of it. It is probably, it's not an overtly right-wing or conservative movie, but I think it has tons of very, very, very traditionalist conservative themes. It's a very masculine movie, and it might be one of the most masculine themed movies I've ever watched. At least it spoke to me in a very masculine way. And my wife likes it, but she doesn't love it, which is interesting because it doesn't speak to her because I think she's a woman. And I think it's a movie that's very man driven, even though there's female characters in it. And I'm very curious, Fisto, to see what your wife thinks about it. So you have to kind of quiz her on it, because I think that like it's a very, you know how we watched the Japanese movie, the Lost in Translation. That was a very feminine movie. It was a very feminine movie, and women tend to really love that movie. And I love that movie too. But it's very from a young woman's perspective emotionally, because it's also a female director. This movie is in a way very similar because it deals with kind of the same themes of aging, fulfillment in life. Did I do enough? Why didn't I do enough? Or, that kind of stuff.
What have I been doing? Well, we watched, we threw the trailer on. We threw the trailer on, and that thing by itself hooked me wanting to watch it, where it's, I want to live the high life, and it's all these images of partying, and there's like this subtle switch to the chanting, and then it cuts to that beautiful shot of the Colosseum at night.
Oh my God.
You just get the sense of, I see what it's doing. It's like, what were you really doing? Right.
It's one of the most beautiful movies of all time. Ooh. Okay. And I will give you a heads up right now. There's two scenes. There's two scenes I want you guys to kind of pay attention for, right? That I love. There's this scene that is one of the most beautiful scenes in any movie of all time. And it is a scene where they take these keys and they go through museums at night, right? Kind of, and it's just this gorgeous scene, right? But then there's a scene that, for some reason, like last time I watched it, I was maybe drinking a little bit too much wine by myself, and it just got me. It's a scene involving a very old nun, a balcony, and flamingos, right? And I'm just like sitting here sobbing at this scene, right? And I don't know if the scene's even intended to be an emotional scene, but there's something about it that just spoke to me in this amazing way. And I'm just sitting there crying. My wife walks down. It's like 3 a.m. I'm like 1.5 bottles of Pinot Noir down. And she's like, oh yeah, you got your crying movie on. She got your crying movie on. I'm going back upstairs. But those are the two scenes I want you guys.
Crying movie. I'm going back to bed.
You guys think about. So what we're gonna do? We're gonna make it a live episode. We're gonna record starting at 5:00 on Wednesday Eastern time. So we live in East Coast time, so we'll do that. There'll be links and stuff. We'll set it up. I'm gonna try to get it to work. I don't know if it's gonna work, but that's kind of the goal. Okay, I don't promise. We'll see. But yeah, so I would recommend you guys watch it over the weekend. I'll post about it too, and then, once again, please go listen to Bleeding Kansas by Mr. McGinty on his Substack. And is your podcast anywhere else but Substack? Is it on Spotify and YouTube and all that stuff?
Yeah, it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast. You can plug the RSS in anywhere.
Okay, so yeah, we'll do that. But we'll share all that stuff. All right, guys, it was a wonderful conversation. We went about 40 minutes over because I can never be quiet because, I mean, look, it's a good episode when I can't stop talking, even though I'm exhausted from work. I wake up at 5 a.m. to go to work. And
there's always that. All right, we're going to be wrapping it up here, and then an hour later.
Right, because there's so much to talk about. I want to talk about abolitionists. I want to talk about Civil War. I want to talk about orthodoxy. I want to talk about Jim Jones, and I want to talk about this kind of stuff. I want, that's the what we thought about when we started this podcast, right? Where it's a bunch of dudes or girls, right? Occasionally, sitting around, a table at a coffee shop, or a lounge, and sipping on coffee or wine and having the conversations that go into the late hours of the night, and that's the key, right? That's what we're doing here, right? So, all right, guys, good night, everybody, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I hope to have some of you guys live in the chat next week. Sounds good. Good night, Fisto. Good night, Jason. Thank you for coming on, and I love you guys.